Picture a bronze cup, cold in your hand, 3,500 years old. Around you the walls of a palace at Knossos are still bright with paint, dolphins arc across blue plaster, a woman with dark curled hair watches from a doorway, and somewhere below your feet a corridor turns, and turns again, until you have forgotten the way out. There is a smell of olive oil and burning saffron. Bulls are painted leaping, and young acrobats leap with them. No one here knows that the sea will rise, that the earth will shake, that the smoke on the horizon is coming closer. For now the lamps are lit, the storerooms are full, and the labyrinth holds its breath. You are standing at the very beginning of a story that will last 2,000 years. Let it carry you. There is nowhere you need to be. So let us stay a while, here on the island of Crete, in a world that had already grown old before the Greece we think we know had even been dreamed. The people who built this place did not call themselves Greeks. They did not, as far as we can tell, call themselves anything we would recognize, for their names for themselves have been swallowed by time. We call them the Minoans, and even that is a borrowed word, lent to them thousands of years later by an English archaeologist who took it from a legend. But they were real. They walked these cool corridors barefoot on plastered floors, they climbed these staircases, they drew water from these deep clay jars, and they left behind the first great civilization of Europe, bright, wealthy, mysterious, and, in its own quiet way, unlike anything that would ever come again. Imagine the palace as it stood around the year 1600 before the Common Era. It is not a castle. There are no battlements, no watchtowers, no thick defensive walls bristling against an enemy. That absence is the first strange and beautiful fact about these people. They lived on an island in the middle of a wide sea, and they did not seem to be afraid. Their walls were made not for war but for storage, for ceremony, for living. The great complex at Knossos sprawled across several acres, rising in places to 4 or even 5 stories, a maze of more than 1,000 interlocking rooms, light wells that dropped sunshine down into the lower floors, staircases that doubled back on themselves, apartments and workshops and shrines all folded together without a single straight line to guide you through. To wander it must have felt exactly like wandering a labyrinth. Perhaps that is where the story began. Move deeper in, and you come to the storerooms, and here you begin to understand where the wealth came from. Along the western side of the palace run long, narrow magazines lined with enormous storage jars, the ones we call pithoi, some of them taller than a grown man, their sides rippled with raised bands and molded rope patterns. Into these jars flowed the 3 great gifts of the Cretan earth: olive oil, wine, and grain, gathered from the farms and villages across the island and brought here to be counted, stored, and sent out again across the water. There were rooms enough at Knossos to hold the surplus of a whole kingdom. And beneath the floors, in stone-lined pits, still more was kept safe. This was not just a home for the powerful. It was a bank, a warehouse, a temple, and a factory, all breathing together under one vast roof. And how did they keep track of it all? Here we come to the little clay tablets, and to one of the loveliest unsolved puzzles in all of human history. The Minoans could write. They pressed marks into soft clay with a fine stylus, marks we now call linear A, a script of perhaps 90 signs, standing for syllables, mixed with tidy little symbols for oil and grain and numbers. Scribes sat in these rooms and recorded what came in and what went out, so many jars of this, so many measures of that. The tablets were never meant to last, they were working notes, meant to dry and eventually be wiped clean or discarded. But fire, the same fire that would one day destroy so much, baked a handful of them hard as stone and preserved them for us to find. And so they survive, and yet we cannot read them. Linear A has never been deciphered. We can sound out some of the signs, we can count their numbers, but the language beneath remains locked. We hold their shopping lists and their ledgers in our hands, and we do not know a single word they say. Somewhere in those marks are the names of gods, of officials, of the island itself, whispering to us in a tongue that no living person has ever understood. Step back out into the light, into a courtyard, and picture the people themselves as they painted themselves upon the walls. Slim-waisted young men with long dark hair, their skin painted a deep reddish brown. Women in bright flounced skirts and open bodices, their eyes wide and dark, moving through gardens of lilies and crocuses. Blue monkeys clamber over rocks. A partridge struts. Dolphins turn in a painted sea. And again, the bull, that great sacred animal, its horns curving up like the crescent moon. In the most famous fresco of all, a bull charges at full gallop while a slender acrobat grips its horns, vaults up and over its back, and lands behind its tail, as companions wait with open arms. Whether this bull leaping was sport, or ritual, or a test of courage before the gods, we do not truly know. But it was clearly something the Minoans held close to their hearts, for they painted it, carved it, and shaped it into gold again and again. Here, too, the myth begins to seep back in. For the later Greeks would tell of a king named Minos who ruled at Knossos, so mighty that even distant Athens sent him tribute. They told of his wife and a monstrous white bull, and of the creature born of that union, the Minotaur, a thing with the body of a man and the head of a bull, kept hidden in a labyrinth built so cunningly that whoever entered could never find the way out. Every few years, they said, young men and women were sent into the dark to feed it, until at last a hero came with a ball of thread to unwind behind him. It is only a story. And yet, a palace like a maze, a people in love with the bull, a hall whose very walls seem designed to make you lose your way. The Greeks who told these tales had never seen Knossos standing whole. They were remembering something they themselves only half understood, a rumor of a lost golden age, drifting down to them across centuries of silence. And that silence is the last thing to sit with tonight. For all their ships and their wealth and their beautiful painted rooms, the Minoans left us almost nothing we can read, no history in their own voice, no chronicle of kings, no telling of why they built as they did or believed as they believed. We know they traded with Egypt, that their pots turned up on distant shores, that their power reached out across the Aegean like a hand upon the water. But of their hearts and their minds, we have only what the plaster remembers. They were the most brilliant people of their age, and they are, to us, almost entirely a mystery, a civilization glimpsed through a bright doorway that closes before we can step through. Because something is coming. Far to the north, out across that wine-dark sea, a mountain of an island is beginning, very quietly, to stir. And when it wakes, the world of the painted palaces will change forever. For a long while, nothing seemed to change. The people of Thera, the ring of an island far to the north of Crete, the one we now call Santorini, went about their lives as they had for generations. And what lives they were! There was a town on that island, a place we call Akrotiri, though we do not know the name its own people used. It was a fine town, prosperous and clever, a smaller cousin to the great harbors of Crete. Its houses rose 2 and 3 stories tall, with staircases and windows and drains beneath the streets to carry away the rain. Inside, the walls were painted, not roughly, but with real tenderness. Blue monkeys clambered across one room. Antelope leapt along another, drawn in a few shore lines, as alive as breath. In one house, 2 young boxers spar with their small fists raised, and in another, a fisherman holds up his catch, strings of bright fish in each hand, proud of his good day. Somewhere on those walls, swallows wheel and dive above red lilies, courting in the spring air. This was a town that liked beauty, that surrounded even its ordinary hours with color. And then the island began to warm them. We think it did, at least. There were tremors first, the ground shivering, cups sliding from shelves, cracks opening in those bright plastered walls. And the people of Akrotiri, being sensible, seemed to have listened. When the archaeologists came, thousands of years later, and dug the town out of the ash, they found something strange and quietly moving. They found almost no bodies. They found no hoards of gold left behind in panic, no jewelry dropped in the streets. The people had gathered what mattered and gone down to their ships, out across the water, before the worst arrived. Where they sailed, and whether they found safe harbor, we do not know. They step out of the light of history at the water's edge, and we lose them there. Because the island did not merely tremble. It burst. Sometime around 1600 years before the Common Era, the exact year still argued over by patient scholars reading tree rings and ice cores and the drowned timbers of old olive branches, the volcano beneath Thera tore itself apart. It was one of the largest eruptions the world has known in all the long span of human memory. A column of ash and stone was flung miles into the sky, so high it would have darkened the sun, and then it fell. It fell on Akrotiri in a hot grey rain, deeper and deeper, until the streets were buried, until the painted rooms were sealed, until the whole town lay tucked beneath dozens of feet of pumice and ash, hidden from weather and time. And that is the gift within the catastrophe. Like Pompeii, far away and far in the future, Akrotiri was smothered so completely that it was preserved. The ash that killed the town also kept it, the staircases, the pots still standing where they were set down, the swallows still turning on the wall. A whole Bronze Age morning, held in stillness, waiting to be found. But the eruption did not only bury an island. When the center of Thera collapsed, when the emptied heart of the volcano fell in upon itself and the sea rushed into that vast wound, it sent out waves. Not the gentle waves that lap ashore, but tsunamis, walls of water moving fast and low across the open sea, gathering height as they reached the land. And to the south, less than 100 miles across that water, lay Crete. Lay the great harbors of the Minoans, their fleets, their coastal towns, their smooth stone quays where the ships of Egypt tied up to trade. We cannot say exactly what those waves did when they arrived. But we can imagine the sea drawing back further than anyone had ever seen it, bearing the harbor floor, the fish flapping on wet stone, and then returning, not as a tide but as a hand, sweeping the boats from their moorings, pushing salt water deep into the storerooms, snapping the tethers of a trading empire that lived and breathed upon the sea. Here we must be honest, as we drift towards sleep, about how much we do not know. For a long time people told a simple story: the volcano erupted, the waves came, and Minoan Crete died in an afternoon. But the earth keeps a more complicated diary. When the scholars looked closely, they found that Crete did not fall all at once. The palaces stood for a while yet after Thera burst, perhaps a generation, perhaps longer. The eruption was not a single blow that ended everything. It was more like a wound that would not close. The fleets that were damaged had to be rebuilt. The coastal towns that were flooded had to be dried out and shored up. The trusted distant partners, who had relied on Cretan ships to come each season, had to be won back. And a civilization whose whole strength lay in the sea, in movement, in exchange, in the confidence that its ships ruled the waves, is a fragile thing once that confidence is cracked. The Minoans went on. But they went on limping, and the world around them had begun to smell weakness on the water. And weakness, in that age as in every age, drew others. Far to the north and west of Crete, on the rugged mainland of Greece, a different sort of people had been growing stronger. We call them the Mycenaeans, after the great hill fortress of Mycenae with its lions carved above the gate. They were not like the graceful, sea-loving Minoans. They built their homes as strongholds, with walls so massive that later Greeks, gazing up at them, could not believe men had lifted such stones and said giants must have done it. They buried their kings with masks of beaten gold and swords laid across their chests. They were warriors first, admirers of the Cretan world second, and for years they had watched those painted palaces across the water with a mixture of hunger and awe. They copied the Minoans. They traded with them, learned from them, wore what they wore and drank from cups shaped as the islanders' cups were shaped. And they waited. At some point in those uncertain years, as Crete lay weakened and its ships fewer, the Mycenaeans stopped merely admiring and simply arrived. We are not sure whether they came as raiders or as opportunists filling a space that had opened, or both, in that untidy way that history so rarely lets us untangle. But the signs are clear enough in the ground. At Knossos, the greatest palace of all, the writing changes. For centuries the Cretan scribes had kept their accounts in a script we call Linear A, a script we still cannot read, the silent language of that vanished people. And then, in the palace's later years, a new script appears, which we call Linear B. When scholars finally cracked it, after long and famous labor, they found something that changed the whole story. The words beneath those unfamiliar signs were not the lost language of the Minoans at all. They were an early form of Greek. The people now keeping the ledgers at Knossos, counting the sheep and the oil and the swords, were speaking the tongue that would one day become the language of Homer. So the masters had changed. The island of the painted rooms now answered, in some fashion, to lords from the mainland who spoke a different language and worshipped, we begin to suspect, rather different gods. The Minoan world did not end in fire so much as it slowly passed into other hands. And those new hands, hard, gold-loving, fond of walls and weapons and the counting of them, were only beginning to reach out toward their own age of glory. What they would build upon the ruins of the Sea Kings, and how their own bright world would end in a darkness deeper than any tsunami, is a story for the hours still ahead of us. Come away now from the sea and the painted island, and turn your face toward the mainland, toward the dry hills of the Argolid where the land rises in folds of grey stone and silver-green olive. The air here is different, not the soft sea breath of Crete, but something harder, hotter, scented with thyme and dust and the resin of pine. And upon a ridge between two deep ravines, where the ground falls away on either side into shadow, there stands a citadel. You have been climbing toward it for a long while, and now, as the path bends, you see the great gate at last. Two lionesses, carved in stone, rear up on either side of a central pillar, their heads long lost to time, their bodies still standing guard above the lintel as they have stood for more than 3,000 years. This is Mycenae. And the men who raised these walls did not build for beauty. They built for war. Feel the stones as you pass beneath the lions. They are enormous, blocks so vast that later Greeks, who had forgotten who set them there, could not believe human hands had done it. They decided, instead, that giants must have built these walls. The Cyclopes, the one-eyed monsters of legend, were said to have piled up these boulders, and so we still call such masonry Cyclopean. Run your imagination along the rough surface of them, each block the weight of a wagon, fitted without mortar, holding one another up by sheer mass and cunning. Behind such walls a king could sleep soundly while the world outside sharpened its spears. And there was a king. The Mycenaeans called him the Wanax, a word that means something close to lord, or overlord, or master of the house. Say it softly to yourself, Wanax. It is one of the oldest royal titles in Europe, and we know it not from any poet, but from little tablets of clay, baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the palaces, and so preserved by accident for us to read. For these mainland lords, unlike the mysterious sea kings before them, wrote in a script we can understand. We call it Linear B, and when a clever architect named Michael Ventris finally cracked it in the middle of the 20th century, the words that came whispering up out of the clay were, astonishingly, an early form of Greek. The tongue of Mycenae was the tongue that would one day sing of Achilles and of Troy. But do not imagine the tablets sang of anything so grand. They are inventories. Ledgers. The patient bookkeeping of a palace that counted everything. So many sheep in such a district. So many measures of wheat and figs and olive oil. So many bronze swords, so many wheels, so many chariots. Women who worked the wool, listed by their trades, spinners, weavers, bath attendants, and the rations of grain and figs doled out to feed them and their children. There is something almost tender in it, and something almost sad, a whole civilization's memory, and what survives is the accounting. The Wanak sat at the center of this web like a great patient spider, and every thread was a debt owed or a gift given or a portion counted out. Nothing moved in his kingdom that the scribes did not press into the wet clay with their sharpened reeds. At the heart of the citadel stood his hall, and this the Greeks remembered long after they forgot the lions. They called it the Megaron. Step into it now in your mind. You pass through a porch, and then a vestibule, and then into a great square room, and there, in the very center of the floor, is a round hearth, ringed with painted plaster, and above it the roof opens to let the smoke drift up into the evening. For wooden columns, tall as trees, rise around the fire to hold up the roof, and against one wall stands the throne. The floors are painted in squares like a chessboard, blue and red and yellow. The walls carry processions of figures, chariots and warriors and long-robed women bearing offerings. Firelight moves upon all of it. And in that flickering warmth the Wanaks feasted his warriors, and the wine went round in cups of gold, and a bard perhaps sang of deeds already old, while outside the great walls kept the darkness out. The gold is no exaggeration. Long before the walls, before the lions, these people buried their dead in deep shafts sunk into the rock, and into those graves they poured wealth of a kind that still stops the breath. When the first excavators dug down into the shaft graves of Mycenae, they found the bones of men laid out with weapons enough for a war, long bronze swords with hilts of gold and ivory, daggers inlaid with running lions and leaping fish, and over the faces of the greatest of them, masks. Thin sheets of gold, beaten into the likeness of a human face, with closed eyes and calm brows and, on one of them, a curling beard. The man who found the most famous of these masks believed, in his romantic heart, that he had gazed upon the very face of Agamemnon, the king who led the Greeks to Troy. He was wrong by some 300 years. The mask is far older than any war at Troy could have been. But the name has stuck, and we call it still the Mask of Agamemnon, a face of gold gazing up out of the earth after 3,500 years of sleep. These were not gentle people, then, whatever the softness of their painted walls. They loved gold, and they loved war, and they loved the counting of both. And they did not stay upon their hills. Go west across the mountains, to sandy Pylos above the sea, where another palace stood, unwalled and confident, its floors painted, its storerooms stacked with thousands of drinking cups waiting for a feast that would never come. Go south to Tiryns, whose walls are thicker even than Mycenae's, honeycombed inside with galleries where a garrison could shelter. And then look outward, beyond the shores of Greece altogether, for Mycenaean pots, that unmistakable pottery painted with octopuses and spirals and marching soldiers, have been dug up on Cyprus, along the coast of the Levant, in Egypt, in Italy and Sicily. Their traders carried oil and wine and worked bronze across the whole eastern sea. And where they did not trade, one suspects, they sometimes simply took. The Egyptians and the Hittites, the great powers of the age, wrote in their own records of raiders and restless peoples out of the isles and the sea, and some of those names may well be theirs. So here they stand, at their noon. The Wanaks on his throne beside the round hearth, the lions above the gate, the scribes pressing the day's accounts into the clay, the ships upon the wine-dark water, trading in one port, raiding the next. For perhaps 250 years this hard bright world held together, a web of palaces from the Argolis to Crete, all counting, all feasting, all fortifying, all reaching out across the Aegean toward wealth and glory. It must have seemed, to those who lived within the great walls, that it would last forever. Walls like these did not fall. Kings like these did not end. And yet the very tablets that tell us all of this survive only because they were burned. Every one of them was baked hard in a fire that no scribe intended, the fire that brought the palace down around it. All across this glittering world, within the span of a single generation, the citadels would burn, the gold would go into the ground, the writing would be forgotten, and a silence would fall so deep that the Greeks who came after would remember none of it, and would think that giants had built the walls. What came out of the darkness to end them, whether enemy, or earthquake, or hunger, or some slow unraveling we can still barely name, is the question that waits for us in the hours ahead. And so we come to the war that everyone remembers, even those who have never read a word of it. Before the citadels burned, before the silence fell, there was a story the Greeks would carry with them into the darkness and out the other side, a story of ships drawn up on a foreign beach, of a city that would not yield, of a quarrel between two proud men that cost the lives of thousands. Whether it happened at all, and how much of it happened, is a question we can lie back and turn over slowly, the way you might turn a smooth stone in your hand in the dark. There is no hurry to answer. The answer has waited 3,000 years, and it will wait a little longer while we settle into it. Picture the beach first. A long, shelving strand on the northwestern corner of what we now call Turkey, where the Aegean narrows toward the straits that lead up to the Black Sea. The Greeks called those straits the Hellespont, and whoever held the land beside them held the doorway to a great deal of trade, grain and metal and horses moving down from the north. On that beach, so the poems say, the black ships were hauled up in their hundreds, their keels grinding into the sand, and behind them a camp of tents and cook fires and men who had been away from home for the better part of 10 years. Out beyond the ships, across a plain of tamarisk and dust, rose the walls of the city they had come to break. Troy. Ilios. The city of Priam, with its towers and its great gates, and behind those gates a people who had learned to live under siege and go on living. The Iliad, the older of the two great poems the Greeks handed down, does not tell you the whole war. This is the thing that surprises people who come to it expecting the wooden horse and the burning towers. It tells you only a handful of weeks near the end, and its true subject is not a city at all but a mood, the anger of one man. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek fighters, has been insulted by his own commander, the High King Agamemnon, who has taken from him a woman awarded as a prize. And so Achilles withdraws. He sits by his ships and will not fight, and while he sulks, his own side is driven back to the water's edge and men die in windrows for the sake of his wounded pride. It is a strangely intimate thing to place at the center of a war epic, not strategy, not glory, but the slow, corrosive burn of a grudge. Homer, whoever Homer was, understood that the largest events turn on the smallest and most human of hinges. Around that grudge the poem builds its unbearable tenderness. Hector, the defender of Troy, saying goodbye to his wife on the wall, reaching for his infant son, who cries at the great horsehair crest of his father's helmet, so that Hector laughs and lifts the helmet off and sets it gleaming on the ground before he takes the child in his arms. He knows, and she knows, that he is going out to die. The poem knows it too. That is what gives these old lines their weight as you drift toward sleep. Everyone in them is doomed, and they are kind to one another anyway, in the little time they have. But was there ever a real beach, a real city, a real war beneath all this poetry? For centuries educated people assumed there was not, that Troy was a beautiful fiction, no more findable than the palace of the gods. Then, in the 1870s, a wealthy and stubborn German named Heinrich Schliemann took a copy of Homer to a low mound in that same northwestern corner of Turkey, a place the Turks called Hisarlik, and began to dig. He dug too fast and too greedily, and he damaged a great deal, and he announced discoveries with more romance than rigor. But he was, in the largest sense, right. Under that mound lay not one city but many, stacked one upon another like the pages of a book left out in the rain, 9 principal cities, each built on the rubble of the last, going down through more than 2,000 years. One of them, the layer the archaeologists label with the sober name of Troy 6 or the one just above it, was a genuine Bronze Age stronghold, great sloping walls of dressed stone, towers, a lower town spreading out beyond the citadel, and signs, in at least one of those layers, of violent destruction, of fire, of hastily buried treasure and unburied bodies. A real city did stand there. A real city did burn. And it was not a Greek city, nor a lonely one. Here the story deepens in a way Homer never knew, because in the 20th century scholars learned to read the clay tablets of the Hittites, that great empire we sat within the hour just past, whose citadels would soon burn along with everyone else's. In the Hittite royal archives, among the letters and treaties, certain names surface again and again. There is a land the Hittites call Wailusa, out toward their western frontier, near the sea. And there is a foreign power, sometimes friend and sometimes nuisance, that they call Ahiyawa, a kingdom of men who come by ship, who meddle in the coastal cities, who must be written to king, as an equal. Say those names slowly in the dark. Wailusa. Ahiyawa. To the ear of anyone raised on Homer they are almost unbearably familiar. Wailusa is very close to the older Greek name for Troy, Ilios, which softened over the centuries into Ilios, the city of the Iliad. And Ahiyawa stands beside the word Homer uses, over and over, for the Greeks themselves, not Greeks, not Hellenes, but Achaeans, the Achai. The Achaeans of Ahiyawa, quarreling over a city called Wailusa on the Hittite coast. The tablets even preserve, in one broken letter, a dispute over that very region, and the name of a man, Alexandru, king of Wailusa, a name that shadows the Trojan prince the Greeks called Alexandros, whom we know better as Paris. None of this proves the war. It proves something quieter and, to my mind, more haunting, that the world of the poem was real. That there was a citadel by the straits worth fighting over, and a seafaring people from across the water who came and interfered, and Hittite kings who watched it all from inland and set it down in clay. The Trojan War, if there was one, was not the 10-year clash of demigods the poets sang. It was more likely one raid, or a handful of raids, in a long and grinding competition for that doorway to the north, the kind of small, ugly, forgettable violence that history rarely bothers to record. And then, out of that forgettable violence, over 4 or 5 centuries of firelit retelling, singers built something that would outlast every empire around it. For that is the strange scene we are standing on tonight, the place where memory and invention fuse so completely that no knife can part them. The Greeks who came after the darkness could not read the tablets of their ancestors. They had lost the writing, lost the names, lost even the knowledge that they had once had cities of their own. All they had left was the song. And the song remembered a war. What it could not tell them, what it did not know it was hiding, was that the beach at Troy and the halls of Mycenae were about to share the same fate. The Achaeans who sailed home in the poems were sailing back to a world that was already beginning to come apart. The fires that took Troy were only the first of many. And the question of what came for the rest of them, for the palaces, the kings, the writing, the whole shimmering age, is the darkness we must walk into next. For a while, if you had stood on the walls of Mycenae in the years around 1200 before our era, you might have believed that nothing could ever end. The citadel sat heavy and certain on its hill, its great gate crowned by 2 carved lionesses facing a column between them, their stone faces worn smooth by weather and by the eyes of everyone who had ever passed beneath. Below the walls, the roads ran out to other citadels much like it, Tiryns with its galleries, Pylos with its painted floors, Thebes, or Kaminos, the wide low palace at Glar. Ships moved between them and the wider world, carrying oil and wine and copper, carrying the small clay tablets on which scribes pressed their careful marks. It was a bright, administered, humming world. And it was, though no one living in it could have known, already listening for a sound it would not survive. The sound, when it came as fire. Not all at once, and not everywhere in the same season, but across 2 or 3 generations the palaces of the Greek mainland burned. At Pylos, in the last hours, a scribe pressed tablets that spoke of watchers set along the coast, of rowers summoned, of bronze being gathered from the sanctuaries, the small anxious paperwork of a kingdom trying to hold itself together. Then the palace burned, and the very fire that destroyed it baked those clay tablets hard, so that the record of the last emergency survived precisely because the emergency was lost. We can read, still, the worried lists of a court that did not see the next morning. One by one the great houses went the same way. Mycenae burned and was partly rebuilt and burned again. Tiryns shook and cracked. The painted walls, the storerooms, the workshops of ivory and gold, all of it went dark, and the smoke that rose from the argolid rose from a whole world going out like a lamp. What did it, exactly, no one can quite say, and that uncertainty is part of the strangeness of this time. There is no single villain to blame, no one battle to point to. Some speak of earthquakes, a run of them along the fault lines that thread the Aegean, toppling walls that had stood for centuries. Some speak of drought and failed harvests, of a climate turning against the crowded palace economies that needed every sack of grain accounted for. Some speak of the palaces themselves, top-heavy, brittle, so dependent on their scribes and their storerooms that once the system stumbled it could not stand back up. And some speak of the raiders, the ones the Egyptians would remember with dread. For Egypt, far to the south, was watching its own coasts. On the walls of the mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, the pharaoh Rameses III had his scribes carve an account of a great confederation of peoples who came out of the sea and the islands, sweeping down through the Levant, burning as they came. No land, the inscription says, could stand before them. They came with their households in ox carts, women and children among them, as though whole nations had pulled up their roots and gone looking for somewhere the fires had not reached. We call them, for want of their own names, the Sea Peoples, a phrase that hides how little we truly know of who they were. Perhaps they were fleeing the same collapse they seemed to be causing. Perhaps the burning and the wandering were the same wound seen from two sides. Around the rim of the Mediterranean, city after city fell in these years, Ugarit on the Syrian coast, its last king writing frantic letters begging for ships and soldiers, letters found still in the kill where they were being baked when the town was overrun. The whole bright network of the Bronze Age, the trade routes and the treaties and the diplomatic marriages, came apart at once, like a single garment unraveling from many threads pulled at the same time. And so we come to the silence. This is the part that is hardest to picture, because it is made of absence. When the palaces fell, the thing that fell with them was not only walls and kings but knowledge itself. The script the scribes had used, the careful marks we call linear B, was a tool for running palaces, for counting sheep and rations and chariot wheels, and when there were no more palaces there was no more need for it, and no one to teach it. Within a generation or two, the Greeks could not write. Not in a new way, at all. An entire people forgot how to read. The tablets that survived lay buried and unreadable beneath the grass, and would stay unreadable for more than 3,000 years, until scholars in the modern world puzzled them open again. But the Greeks of the dark centuries walked over that lost writing without knowing it was there. Everything grew smaller. The towns shrank to villages, and the villages to clusters of huts. Populations thinned. In some regions the number of settlements we can find drops away to almost nothing, as though the land had quietly emptied. The long-distance trade guttered out, no more tin from the Far East, less bronze, and so people turned increasingly to iron, the metal you could find closer to home, and in that slow necessity the Iron Age was quietly born out of hardship rather than triumph. The great tombs stopped being built. Where once a Mycenaean lord had been laid in a vast beehive of dressed stone heaped with gold masks and inlaid daggers, now the dead went into simple graves with a pot or two, a pin, a modest ring. The horizon of life drew in close. A person born into these centuries might live and die having never seen a building larger than a barn, never met a scribe, never heard a language they could not understand spoken by a trader from over the sea. The world had become quiet, and small, and local, and forgetful. Historians once called it, simply, the Dark Age, not because the people were cruel or brutish, but because the lights that let us see a past clearly, the writing and the records and the monuments, had all gone out, leaving us to feel our way through the dark almost by touch. And yet, and this is the thread we follow out of the silence, the dark was never total. Even in these poorest, quietest centuries, something in the Greeks refused to forget how to make a beautiful thing, or to honor a life that mattered. On the long island of Euboea, at a place we now call Lefkandi, in the 10th century before our era, deep in what should have been the emptiest of the dark, someone built a great long building of mud brick and timber, longer than any hall raised in Greece for centuries. And in it they buried a man whose ashes were wrapped in fine cloth and laid in a bronze urn brought, astonishingly, all the way from Cyprus, and beside him a woman adorned with gold, and near them, in their own pit, for horses, laid down as though for a lord out of the old songs. Whoever this man was, the people who buried him gave him the funeral of a hero, in an age that supposedly had no heroes left, no wealth, no reach across the sea, and yet here was gold, and foreign bronze, and a building fit for a king. It is a single point of light in a very long night, and it tells us the memory of greatness had not died, it had only gone underground, waiting. Something was being remembered here, and something, slowly, was beginning again. But what kind of world would grow up out of these ashes, what the Greeks would become when they finally came blinking back into the light, and where they would find the letters to write their own name once more, that is a story still gathering in the dark ahead. There is a moment, in the long recovery that follows a dark age, when a people stop merely surviving and begin, once more, to imagine. You cannot mark it on a calendar. There was no morning when the Greeks woke and knew the night was over. It came the way dawn comes to someone half asleep, a graying at the edges, a warmth you feel before you see it, the slow return of shapes to a room that had been only shadow. And so it was across the 10th and 9th and 8th centuries before our era, in the scattered villages of a land that had forgotten how to write its own name. Something was stirring. Let us walk quietly through it, the way you might move through a house at first light, careful not to wake anyone, watching the world come slowly back. Begin with the metal. For centuries the great secret of power had been bronze, that beautiful alloy of copper and tin, gleaming and golden, the stuff of the hero's armor and the palace stores. But bronze had a weakness woven into its very making. Tin was rare, and it came from far away, carried along trade routes that stretched to the edges of the known world, and when those routes collapsed in the great unraveling, the bronze grew scarce and precious and hard to come by. Into that gap came iron. Iron was everywhere. It lay in the ordinary red earth of Greece itself, in the bog and the hillside, needing no long voyage to reach the smith's fire. It was harder to work, stubborn, demanding higher heat and greater skill, but once a village had learned the trick of it, it no longer depended on distant kings and their guarded trade. A farmer could have an iron blade for his plough, an iron edge for his sickle. Power, in a sense, came down from the palace and settled into the hands of ordinary people. You can hear it, if you listen, the ring of hammer on anvil in 100 small settlements, each one a little forge of independence, each one no longer waiting on a lord across the sea. And with the iron came the fields. Slowly the terraces were rebuilt, the olive tended again, the vine trained along its stake. Where once there had been a handful of frightened families clinging to a hilltop, now there were clusters of houses, then hamlets, then something you might almost call a town. People who had scattered began, gently, to come together, drawn by the well, by the shared threshing floor, by the flat piece of ground where the whole community could gather. And on the highest point, or beside the sacred spring, they began to build something they had not built in centuries. Not a palace. Not a fortress. A house for a god. These first temples were humble things, and it would spoil them to imagine the marble glory that came later. Picture instead a long, narrow building of mud brick on a base of rough stone, its roof of thatch held up by wooden posts, a single room where an image of the god might stand. at Lefkandi, on that same island where the hero of the previous age was laid to rest beneath his great hall, and at other quiet places across the Greek world, these shrines rose from the earth. But notice what they meant. To build a temple, a community must agree. It must decide, together, that this god belongs to all of them, that here is a place worth the labor of many hands, worth the offering of the harvest, worth returning to season after season. A temple is a promise a village makes to itself, that it will still be here next year, and the year after, and that its children will gather where its parents gathered. The scattered were knitting themselves whole. But of all the things returning in that slow dawn, the most miraculous, the one that would let the Greeks reach across the centuries and touch us, tonight, came off a ship. It came with the Phoenicians, those extraordinary sailors and traders from the coast of what is now Lebanon, who ranged the whole Mediterranean in their tubby merchant vessels, dealing in purple dye and cedar and glass, in silver and stories. And among their cargo they carried something weightless and beyond price. They carried letters. The Phoenicians wrote with an alphabet, a small, elegant set of signs, each one standing for a sound, so that with only a couple of dozen marks a person could set down anything at all that the tongue could say. It was not the cumbersome old writing of the vanished palaces, the dense syllabary that only trained scribes could manage and which had died with them. This was simple enough for a merchant to keep his accounts, simple enough, in time, for a farmer's son to learn. The Greeks took it, and they made it their own, and in doing so they did something the Phoenicians had not. The Phoenician letters recorded only the consonants, leaving the vowels to be guessed. The Greeks, borrowing signs they did not need for sounds their language lacked, turned them into vowels, the A, the E, the O, and so created the first true alphabet in the world, one that could capture speech exactly, every breath of it, the long vowels and the short. It was as though someone had handed them a net fine enough to catch not just fish but the very shimmer on the water. And what did they choose to catch first? Not tax records. Not the deeds of kings. Some of the earliest scratches of Greek writing we have ever found are lines of poetry, a jug awarded as a prize in a dance, a cup that jokes about the wine and love it promises. From the very first, this writing was joyful. For 400 years the Greeks had kept their memory alive with nothing but the human voice. In the darkness, when the palaces were rubble and the writing forgotten, the poets had remembered. Generation after generation, singers had passed down the great tales of a war against a city called Troy, of a king who could not find his way home, of gods who walked among men, reshaping them at every telling, holding them in nothing more solid than breath and rhythm and the trained heart. Now, at last, the net was ready. And in that dawning age lived two men, or perhaps two names gathered from many mouths, whom we call Homer and Hesiod. One sang of heroes and their rage and their homesickness, the other of the gods' own beginnings and of the hard, honest work of the farming year. And their songs, which had lived so long only in the air, were, at last, written down. Fixed. Saved from the endless erosion of forgetting. Think of what that means, lying here in the quiet. A people who had lost so much, their kings, their scribes, their reach across the sea, even the knowledge that they had once been great, had found their way back to the one power that outlasts empires. They could remember again, and now they could remember on purpose, and keep it, and pass it forward not as a fading echo but as a thing you could hold. The long night was ending. The Greeks were coming back into the light with a gift in their hands that would outlast everything they built in stone. And yet a written song is a strange kind of seed. Once the tales of Homer were fixed and shared, once every village could gather round the same remembered heroes and the same bright gods, a question began to stir that none of them could yet have asked aloud. If we are all one people, hearing one story, then what, exactly, are we to become? The answer was already forming in the crowded valleys and the growing towns, in a new kind of place that had never existed in the world before, and to which all this remembering was only the quiet beginning. The valley wakes slowly in the 8th century before our era, and the change, when it comes, comes without a trumpet. There is no king to announce it, no single morning on which the world turns over. Instead, there is simply a little more of everything. A few more mouths to feed, a few more fields cleared from the scrub, a few more roofs clustered where before there had been only one or two. The dark centuries had thinned the Greeks almost to silence. Now, quietly, over the span of a few generations, they begin to thicken again into a people. Pottery grows finer and more plentiful. Iron tools bite the soil. Trade goods drift back along the sea lanes, jars of oil and wine moving out, strange coins and stranger stories coming in. And in the middle of these swelling settlements, something entirely new begins to take shape, not a thing you could point to at first, but a way of living together that the world had never quite seen before. They came to call it the polis. We translate it, a little clumsily, as the city-state, but neither word is quite right. It was smaller than a city and larger than a town, and it was less a place than a belonging. A polis was the people and the land and the gods all bound into one, a community that could look at itself and say, without a crown to say it for them, we are this. Picture it not as walls and towers but as a kind of gathering. There is high ground, the Acropolis, the upper city, where the oldest and most sacred things sit close to the sky, a temple perhaps, or the memory of one, a refuge if enemies come. And below it, at the heart of things, an open space of trodden earth, unremarkable to the eye, and yet the true center of everything. The agora. A marketplace, yes, where a farmer might trade a basket of olives for a length of cloth. But more than that, a meeting place, a talking place, the one patch of ground where men who owed obedience to no lord could stand together and argue about what they should do. Around these two poles, the sacred height and the common ground, the whole life of the polis arranged itself, the way iron filings arrange themselves around a hidden magnet. What is strange, when you sit with it in the quiet, is how many of these little worlds sprang up, and how alike and how separate they were. Not one polis but hundreds, scattered across the folded mountains and the islands like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Each valley kept its own, cradled by ridges too high to bother crossing every day. Athens in its wide plain. Corinth astride its narrow neck of land, with a sea on either side. Sparta in the long green trough of its river valley, already something harder and stranger than its neighbors. Thebes, Argos, Megara, and 100 smaller names now half forgotten. Each fiercely its own. Each with its own laws forming, its own festivals, its own particular gods watching from its own particular hill. If you had walked among them then and asked what held them together, no one could have shown you a capital, or a throne, or a single man whose word ran from one end of the land to the other. There was no such thing. There never would be. And yet, and here is the wonder of it, these scattered, quarrelsome, stubbornly independent little communities somehow knew themselves to be one people. Hellenes. Greeks. Not because anyone ruled them into it, but because of the things they chose, again and again, to do together. The first of these gatherings, or at least the first they remembered clearly enough to date, unfolded on a plain in the western Peloponnese, at a sanctuary called Olympia. The year, as they later counted it, was 776 before our era, and from that some of the Greeks would reckon their history, not in the reign of any king, but in Olympiads, 4-year spans measured from one festival to the next. Imagine the roads in the weeks before. Men walking, riding, sailing in from every valley and island, from cities that in any ordinary season might be at each other's throats. And for the duration of the games, a sacred truce laid over the whole restless land, weapons set aside, safe passage granted, so that a runner from Sparta and a runner from Athens might stand in the same dust and test themselves against each other under the same sun. At first it was almost nothing, a single foot race the length of the stadium, won that first year, so the story goes, by a cook named Coroebus. But it grew. Wrestling, boxing, the chariots, the throwing of the discus and the spear. The prize was not gold but a wreath of wild olive, cut from a sacred tree. And that was the point. What a man won at Olympia was not wealth. It was glory, and the knowledge that Greeks from every corner had watched him win it, and would carry his name home. For at the center of the game stood not a stadium but an altar. All of it was done in the sight of Zeus, whose great temple would one day rise there, whose presence made the plain a holy place. The contests were an offering. And this is the thread worth holding as you drift: the Greeks did not become one people by conquering each other. They became one people by kneeling, together, before the same gods. What one polis could not do with an army, a shared shrine could do with a festival. Nowhere was this truer than at a place high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where a spring welled up among the rocks and a fissure, so they believed, breathed vapors from the deep earth. This was Delphi, and here the Greeks placed the navel of their world, a carved stone called the omphalos that marked, they said, the very center of all things. They came to Delphi not to compete but to ask. For here dwelt the oracle of Apollo, and here a woman called the Pythia sat above the sacred cleft and spoke, in riddles and in fragments, the gods' answers to the questions men brought her. Should we found a colony across the sea? Should we go to war? Whom should we trust, and what does the future hold? Kings and farmers and whole cities sent their questions up that winding mountain road, and the answers they carried down shaped decisions from one end of the Greek world to the other. Think of what that means. A city in Sicily and a city on the coast of Asia might never have exchanged a word, and yet both looked to the same voice on the same mountain to tell them what the gods intended. Delphi belonged to no one, and so it belonged to everyone. It was neutral ground made holy, a place where the scattered pieces of a fractured land could all turn their faces toward the same point and feel, for a moment, the pull of a single center. So the shape of the thing was set. A people with no king and no capital, bound not by a ruler but by the things they held in common, the same heroes remembered from Homer's songs, the same gods on the same hills, the same games at Olympia, the same voice at Delphi. A unity of feeling laid gently over a landscape of stubborn independence, like a single sky over 100 separate valleys. It was a beautiful and a fragile arrangement, and for a long while it held. But a people who share everything except a master must eventually decide, each polis for itself, how they are to be ruled from within, who shall speak in the agora, and who shall be silent, and whose hand shall hold the power when the wreaths are hung up and the festival is over. In those crowded valleys, behind the temples and the marketplaces, that question was already beginning to burn. And the answers the Greeks would reach for, some of them cruel, one of them so new it had no name yet, would set the little cities against one another, and against themselves, in ways that no oracle had thought to warn them of. There is a moment, in the story of every crowded people, when the land itself seems to grow smaller. Not that the mountains moved, or the sea drew back, but that the children kept coming, and the fields did not stretch to meet them. Picture a valley in Greece around the middle of the 8th century before our era, a place you might have known, terraced and stone-walled, its olive trees older than any living grandfather. A family farm, divided among sons, and then divided again, until each brother held a strip too narrow to feed a household. The Greeks had a hard, honest word for this pressure. They called it stenochoria, the narrowness of the land. And when a land grows too narrow, a people must either quarrel over the last few furrows, or they must look outward, past the headland, to where the sun goes down over the water. They looked outward. And what they saw, when they looked, was a sea that did not so much divide the world as stitch it together, a highway of blue that a small ship could cross in days, carrying 100 hungry men and a jar of sacred fire from the mother city's hearth. For that was how it began, not as conquest, but as departure. A city that had grown too full would gather those it could not keep, younger sons, the landless, the ambitious, sometimes simply the unlucky, and it would send them to the oracle at Delphi to ask the god where they should go. The priestess would name a direction, a coast, a river mouth. And the settlers would sail, carrying embers from the public hearth of home so that the new town, wherever it rose, might light its first fire from the old one. A daughter city, tied to her mother across the water by nothing but memory and a flame. They went first to the west, to the fat crescent of southern Italy and the great triangular island of Sicily, so rich in wheat and vine that later ages would call the whole region Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Around 733 before our era, settlers from Corinth came to a marshy island off the Sicilian shore, a place of freshwater springs and good anchorage, and there they founded Syracuse. You would not, standing on that low island in its first year, have guessed what it would become: a handful of huts, a beached ship, men clearing reeds. Yet Syracuse would swell over the centuries into one of the largest and most magnificent cities of the entire Greek world, a place of harbors and theaters and tyrants, so great that one day it would humble Athens herself. But that is a night far ahead of this one. For now, only the springs, and the reeds, and the Corinthian fire flickering in a clay pot on the shore. Up and down that western coast the daughter cities multiplied, each one seeding others in turn. There was Sybaris, whose people grew so wealthy and so fond of comfort that their very name gave us the word Sybaritic, luxurious to the point of softness. There was Croton, where a thinker named Pythagoras would one day gather his silent followers to ponder the secret music of numbers. There was Naples, whose Greek name, Neapolis, meant simply the new city, and which has never stopped being a city from that day to this. And far to the north and west, near the marshy delta where a great river met the sea, adventurers from a place called Phocaea, on the coast of Asia Minor, sailed almost the whole length of the Mediterranean to found a trading town among the Celtic tribes of Gaul. They called it Massalia. You know it now by a softer, rounder name, Marseille. It has been a port for 2,600 years, and the vines that clothe the hills of southern France today are the distant grandchildren of cuttings the Greeks first carried ashore there, for wherever the Greeks settled, they planted the grape and pressed the wine, as though a coast were not truly civilized until it could offer a cup. And they did not only go west. They turned, too, toward the cold and misty northeast, threading their ships through the narrow strait where two continents almost touch, and out into the wide, grey, tideless waters of the Black Sea. It was a fearsome place to the early imagination. The Greeks first called it the Exynos, the inhospitable sea, before familiarity softened it into the Euxine, the hospitable one, the way you might rename a dog once you learned it did not bite. Along its shores, among Scythian horsemen and endless grasslands, they built colonies that would ship home the one thing crowded Greece always craved: grain. Wheat from the black earth of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, poured into the holds of Greek ships, carried back across the water to feed the very mother cities whose narrowness had sent the settlers away in the first place. It was a circle, of a kind, the surplus children of a hungry land returning, as merchants, to fill its granaries. And southward, at the very edge of the known world, they came at last to Egypt, that ancient kingdom, older than anything in Greece, older than almost anything anywhere, with its pyramids already grey with 1,000 years and more of weather. The Egyptians did not permit foreigners to wander freely, but they granted the Greeks a single town on a branch of the Nile, a trading post called Naucratis, where merchants from a dozen Greek cities might live, and trade, and worship their own gods behind their own walls. There the Greeks bought grain and linen and papyrus, and there, one imagines, they stood in the shadow of monuments so vast and so old that even their boldest sailors must have felt young and small, a clever, restless, quarrelsome people, newly arrived at the doorway of a civilization that had already forgotten more history than the Greeks had yet made. Consider, as you drift toward sleep, what these little wooden ships were truly carrying. Not only settlers, and embers, and the cuttings of vines. They carried the alphabet, those letters the Greeks had lately borrowed from Phoenician traders and reshaped to fit their own tongue, adding the vowels that made true writing possible, and they scattered it along every coast they touched, so that the shape of our own letters, the very A and B you learned as a child, can be traced back through this seafaring century to a shore near you tonight. They carried coined money, that new and clever invention of stamped metal, and with it the whole idea that value could travel in a purse. They carried the design of the temple and the layout of the marketplace and the notion, strange and stubborn, of the polis itself, the self-governing city where free men debated their own affairs. From a scatter of rocky valleys no larger than a modern county, a small people had, in 2 centuries, laid a thin bright thread of their language and their customs and their gods around nearly the entire rim of the inland sea, from the coast of Spain to the mouth of the Nile. It was an astonishing thing to have done, and they did it almost without noticing they were doing it, city by city, cargo by cargo, one sailing season at a time. But every daughter city was also a small independent world, with its own hearth and its own assembly and its own fierce sense of itself, owing its mother nothing but affection. And a people so scattered, so multiplied, so accustomed to governing themselves in 100 separate places, would sooner or later have to answer the question that had begun to burn back home, in the crowded valleys they had left behind. Now that a man might be a citizen and not a subject, now that the land itself had taught him he could sail away and build his own city on his own terms, who, exactly, should rule? And what would happen in one particular dusty town, a town called Athens, when that question was finally asked aloud, and would not be answered by any king? Before Athens ever raised its voice, another city had already answered that question, who should rule, and answered it so completely, so strangely, that the rest of Greece would spend centuries half in awe of it and half in fear. To find it, you would leave the sea behind. You would turn inland, southward into the Peloponnese, into a long valley closed on both sides by mountains, and there, in the plain of Laconia, beside a shallow river called the Eurotas, you would come at last to Sparta. It did not look like much. That is the first thing the travelers always remarked upon, with a kind of puzzled wonder. There were no great walls, for the Spartans said their walls were the bodies of their young men. There were no soaring temples of marble, no crowded harbor, no forest of merchant masts. Sparta was not really a city at all in the way Corinth or Miletus were cities. It was a scattering of 4 or 5 villages along the river, low houses of mud brick and timber, orchards, and threshing floors, and above them the grey shoulders of Mount Aegitus, snow on its heights even in the warmer months, so that the plain lay in the long cool shadow of the mountain for much of the day. A quiet place. A place that seemed, to the eye, almost humble. And yet all Greece knew that behind that quiet lived the most feared soldiers in the world. The Spartans explained themselves with a story, and the story had a name in it, Lycurgus, the lawgiver. Whether he ever truly lived, no one could say for certain, even then. He belonged to that soft and distant time where memory fades into legend, where a single figure is made to carry the weight of things that must really have taken generations to grow. But the Spartans believed in him utterly, and the belief was itself a kind of law. Lycurgus, they said, had gone traveling in his youth, to Crete, to Ionia, perhaps as far as Egypt, studying the ways that men governed themselves, and had come home troubled by what he saw everywhere else, the greed, the soft luxury, the endless quarrels between the rich and the poor. And so he gave his people a new design. Not a set of buildings. A set of rules for how to live, cut deep and meant never to change. He is said to have made the Spartan swear an oath to keep his laws untouched until he returned from one last journey, and then to have walked away and never come back, so that the oath could never be released. If the story is a fable, it is a fable about the thing the Spartans wanted most, which was permanence. To build something that would not drift, would not soften, would not be argued away by the next clever generation. At the heart of the design was the raising of the young, and here the gentleness of the valley falls away, and you meet the hard iron at the center of the song. A Spartan boy did not belong, first, to his mother and father. He belonged to the state. At around the age of 7 he was taken from his home and given over to the agoge, the rearing, the training, the long communal upbringing that would shape him until he was a grown man. He slept not in a bed but on rushes he had gathered himself from the river bank. He was fed a little, deliberately a little, and left to make up the rest by stealing, and punished not for the theft but for being caught, so that even hunger became a lesson in cunning and nerve. He went without shoes to harden his feet, without a second garment through the cold of winter. He was set against the other boys in contests of running and wrestling and endurance, watched always by older men, taught to speak rarely and to the point. That clipped, dry manner of speech we still call laconic, after Laconia, the very land he stood upon. He learned the songs and the poetry, yes, but the poetry was of courage and of dying well. Everything, every hour of it, bent toward a single end, to make a man who would stand in the battle line and not break. And when he was grown he did not simply go home. He ate his meals, still, at a common mess with the other men, contributing his share of barley and cheese and wine and the dark famous broth the rest of Greece shuddered at. He might marry, but for years he would visit his wife almost in secret, slipping away from the barracks in the dark. His life was not his own. It was pledged, from childhood to old age, to the phalanx, that wall of overlapping shields and leveled spears that no enemy in the open field could yet be sure of breaking. This was what Sparta had chosen. Not wealth, not art, not the crowded brilliance of the sea-trading towns. It had chosen, above all other things, to be perfect at war. But such perfection has a price, and the price was paid by other people, and it is the darkest thread in the whole weave. For the Spartans to spend their every waking hour in training, someone else had to plant the barley and press the olives and tend the flocks. That labor fell to the Helots, the whole population held in bondage, tied to the land, working the fields of Laconia and, above all, of the rich country over the mountains to the west, called Messenia. Long ago, in 2 long and bitter wars, the Spartans had marched into Messenia and conquered it, and taken its people not as slaves to be bought and sold one by one, but as an entire subject nation, bound to the soil, made to hand over a fixed share of everything they grew. The Helots outnumbered their masters many times over. And the Spartans never forgot it. That, in the end, is the quiet terror beneath the whole design, that the iron discipline was not only pride, but fear. A small people, ringed by a far larger people they had crushed and could not trust, who might rise at any harvest. So the Spartans made themselves into soldiers because they could not afford, ever, to be anything else. And who ruled such a place? Not one king but 2, always 2, from 2 royal houses side by side, so that neither could grow too strong, kings who led the armies in war and offered the sacrifices, but who sat, in the council, among elders. For beside them stood the Gerousia, a council of old men, and the assembly of citizens who could roar their approval or their refusal, and, in time, the ephors, 5 officials chosen each year, who could check even the kings themselves. It was a strange machine of balances, invented, the Spartans said, by Lycurgus for exactly the reason that answered the great question burning back in the crowded valleys: who should rule? Sparta's answer was that no single man should, and no single passion should, that the city itself should rule, through its unbending law, and every man within it, king or boy, should bend his whole life to serve that. For centuries it worked. Sparta grew feared and admired and imitated and never quite equaled, a still, hard, watchful thing in the south of Greece. But a design built to hold everything perfectly in place has one deep weakness, and it is this: it cannot bear to change, and the world it stands in will not stop changing. Far to the north and east, in that dusty argumentative town by the sea, men were beginning to try the opposite experiment, to let the many speak, to let the law be argued and remade. And one day, sooner than either of them guessed, these 2 answers to the same old question would have to stand in the same room and look at one another. But that reckoning was still generations away, and to understand it, we must first go back to Athens, and watch how a city torn between the rich and the poor learned, slowly and painfully, to govern itself. Across the sea from Sparta, on a wide plain broken by hills and threaded with the smell of salt and olive and dust, another city was learning to become itself. Athens was old already, older than its own memory, and it did not look like a place designed by anyone. Where Sparta was a single stern idea carved into stone, Athens was a tangle, a huddle of villages that had grown together over the centuries beneath the great rock of the Acropolis, farmers and potters and traders and fishermen, each with their own gods and their own grudges. And in the years we are speaking of now, the 7th century before our era, this tangle was in trouble. For while a few families grew rich on the best land, the wide plains near the city, the many grew poor, and poorer, and then something worse than poor. A farmer who had a bad harvest borrowed against his land. When he could not repay, he borrowed against himself. And so across Attica there stood men working fields that had once been theirs, marked now with stone pillars that named their debt, and beyond even those there were men and women and children who had been sold into slavery abroad because a season had failed and a loan had come due. It was a city quietly eating its own. In the darkness of that unrest, the first answer that came was not mercy but iron. Around 621 before our era, a man named Draco was given the task of writing down the laws, and this was itself a kind of revolution, for until then the law had lived only in the heads of the noble judges, who could remember it whichever way suited them best. To set it down where anyone could see it was to take a little power from the powerful. But the laws Draco wrote were savage. Nearly every offense, they said, deserved death. Steal a cabbage, and die. Idle away your days, and die. When men later asked why the punishments were so uniformly terrible, one story has him answer that the small crimes deserved death, and for the great ones he could find no heavier penalty. His name has come down to us in a single cold word we still use, draconian, for any law too harsh for the thing it punishes. And yet notice what had happened, quietly, beneath the cruelty. The law was now a thing outside any one man. It was written. It could be read, and pointed at, and one day argued with. That was the seed. The man who watered it was named Solon, and he is one of those figures the Greeks half remembered and half made into legend, a merchant and a poet and a traveler who was trusted, remarkably, by both the desperate poor and the frightened rich. Around the year 594 they gave him a strange and enormous power, to reform the city however he saw fit, to be for a moment its sole lawgiver, and both sides expected him to take their part. Instead he took, in a way, the part of Athens itself. His first act has a plainness that still moves. He cancelled the debts. He tore up the pillars that stood in the fields naming what men owed, and he called it the Sysakthea, the shaking off of burdens. He forbade, from that day, the lending of money on the security of a man's own body. No Athenian could ever again be made a slave for owing. And those who had already been sold abroad, into households in strange cities where they had half forgotten their own tongue, he brought home and bought back with the city's money. Imagine being one of them, a man who had been a name on a slave ledger in some foreign port, walking back up the dusty road toward the rock of the Acropolis, a free citizen again by the stroke of another man's pen. Solon did not make everyone equal. He was too clear-eyed for that, and perhaps too cautious. He sorted the citizens into 4 classes by their wealth, and the highest offices stayed with the richest. But, and this is the quiet hinge on which everything afterward turns, he gave even the poorest class, the laborers, the thetes, the men with almost nothing, one thing, a seat in the assembly, and a vote in the courts. The lowest man could now sit in judgment on the highest. He could not yet rule, but he could no longer simply be ruled over in silence. And then Solon did the thing that made him wisest of all. Having remade the city, he made everyone swear to keep his laws unchanged for 10 years, and he left. He sailed away, to Egypt and to Lydia and to the edges of the known world, so that no one could come to him and beg him to bend his own rules, and so that Athens would have to learn to stand on the laws without leaning on the man who wrote them. But laws are not the same as peace, and the old hungers had not died, they had only been held down for a while. The rich still wanted the land back. The regions of Attica still quarreled, the men of the coast against the men of the plain against the poor hill country men. And into that quarrel stepped a clever, charming, patient soldier named Pisistratus, who had won glory in war and knew exactly how much the people longed for someone strong to take their side. 3 times he seized power over Athens, and twice he was thrown out again, and the manner of his takings tells you everything about him. Once, the tale goes, he drove into the city with a tall and beautiful woman dressed as the goddess Athena standing beside him in his chariot, and had heralds cry that the goddess herself was bringing him home, and some of the people, astonishingly, believed it, or wanted to. He became what the Greeks called a tyrant, which then meant not a monster but simply a man who had taken sole power outside the law. And here is the strange, unsettling truth that sleep-soft histories often smooth away: he ruled well. He kept Solon's laws in place, lent money to poor farmers, sent judges out into the countryside so justice reached the villages, and adorned the city with festivals and buildings that Athenians would remember for centuries. A gentle tyranny is still a tyranny. The freedom to argue was gone, and the city obeyed one house, but it was under this soft weight that ordinary Athenians grew used to their laws working, their courts sitting, their festivals binding them together as one people rather than warring villages. The tyrant, without ever meaning to, was raising a city that would not need a tyrant. His sons were harder and less loved, and after murder and fear and the meddling of Sparta the family was at last driven out near 510. And then, in the confusion that followed, a man named Cleisthenes did something no one had quite done before. Locked in a struggle with his rivals and losing, he turned, deliberately, almost desperately, to the common people, and offered them not favors but power itself. Around 508 he tore up the old map of Athens. He took the citizens out of their ancient family tribes, the tribes the noble houses controlled, and he scattered them into 10 new tribes drawn cunningly across coast and city and inland so that each one mixed rich with poor, fisherman with farmer, and no old bloodline could command a block of its own. He built a council of 550 from each tribe, chosen by lot, so that an ordinary potter or plowman might find himself, for a year, helping to steer the whole city. It was clumsy and radical and unfinished, and it did not yet have all of its later machinery. But something real had been born, and it would soon be given a name: democratia, the power of the demos, the people. The word had, at last, a body. And yet a newborn thing is a fragile thing, easily strangled in its first breath. This raw and untried self-rule had scarcely drawn that breath before word came, over the sea and across the mountains, that far to the east an empire vaster than anything the Greeks had ever imagined was turning its slow and curious gaze toward the small quarrelsome cities on the edge of its world. Come east with me now, away from the olive terraces and the white marble of the little cities, out beyond the islands, beyond the coast of Asia, to where the sun rises over land so wide that a man might ride for a season and never reach their edge. Here, in your mind's eye, let the map unroll like a great carpet: the reed marshes of Babylon, the snow-capped mountains of the Zagros, the burning red plateaus of Iran, the green ribbon of the Nile, the cold rivers of the north. All of it, from the Aegean shore to the passes of India, was gathered under a single crown. The Greeks, when they spoke of it, lowered their voices. They called its ruler simply the Great King, as though there could be no other, and in their bedtime tales and market rumors he became a figure half of flesh and half of legend, sitting somewhere unimaginably far away upon a golden throne. It had not always been so. 2 generations before, the Persians had been a small, hardy people of herdsmen and horse breeders, tucked into the highlands, paying tribute to the Medes who ruled above them. Then came a man named Cyrus, and the world was rearranged around him. He turned upon his overlords and mastered them, and then he did not stop. He took the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia, whose king Croesus was so rich that his name became a byword for gold. He took Babylon, the oldest and proudest city on earth, and he took it, the stories say, almost gently, walking in as a liberator rather than a conqueror. What made Cyrus remarkable, and what the Greeks never quite understood, was that he did not grind the peoples he conquered into a single grey paste. He let them keep their gods, their temples, their customs, their languages. He sent the exiled Jews home from Babylon to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, and they blessed his name in their scriptures. His empire was not a prison but a vast, tolerant patchwork, held together by roads and respect and the slow certainty of overwhelming power. After Cyrus came Cambyses, who added Egypt to the collection, and after him, through a tangle of intrigue that we shall leave sleeping, came the man who would matter most to our story, Darius. Darius was not born to rule, he seized the throne and then spent his reign proving he deserved it, and he did so not chiefly as a warrior but as an organizer, a builder, a keeper of accounts. Picture him dividing his colossal domain into some 20 provinces, each governed by a satrap, each owing a fixed and reckoned tribute in silver and horses and grain. Picture the royal road he built, running 1,500 miles and more from the coast of Asia up to his capital at Susa, with fresh horses and riders stationed all along it, so that a message could cross the whole empire in a week. It was said of these couriers that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor the darkness of night stayed them from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, a phrase that has outlived the empire that inspired it. Darius minted gold coins stamped with his own image, dug a canal to join the Nile to the Red Sea, and raised at Persepolis a palace of such scale and beauty that its ruined columns still stand against the sky today. This was the power that was beginning, slowly, to turn its face toward Greece. And here is the thing you must hold gently in your thoughts as you drift: the great king did not, at first, particularly care about Greece at all. Why would he? To an emperor who counted Egypt and Babylon and Lydia among his possessions, the mainland Greeks were a poor and distant fringe, a scatter of quarrelsome hill towns with no gold to speak of, forever squabbling over scraps of rocky soil. The Greeks who did matter to him were nearer at hand. For along the western coast of Asia Minor, on the very shore of the empire, lay a string of Greek cities that had been planted there centuries before: the Ionians, cousins of Athens, clever and prosperous and proud. Miletus, Ephesus, Priene, the island of Samos, rich trading towns of philosophers and merchants, of the first men who had ever asked what the world was made of. And these cities, for all their brilliance, now answered to Persia. Darius ruled them through local strongmen he had installed, tyrants who governed in his name and kept the tribute flowing, and the Ionians chafed and grumbled beneath a yoke that sat lightly on their bodies but heavily on their spirits. In the year we would call 499 before the Common Era, that grumbling caught fire. The spark was, as sparks so often are, a matter of ambition gone wrong. A ruler of Miletus named Aristagoras, having promised the Persians an easy conquest that failed, found himself suddenly ruined and afraid, and he did the only thing that might save him: he threw off his own tyranny, declared for freedom, and called his fellow Ionians to rise against the great king. And rise they did. City after city cast out its Persian-backed tyrant. The revolt spread up and down the coast like flame along a dry hedge. It was a reckless, glorious, doomed thing, and everyone but the men living it might have seen how it must end. But before it ended, the Ionians reached across the water for help, and here is where the threads of our story begin, at last, to twist together. Aristagoras sailed to the mainland to plead his cause. Sparta, cautious and land-bound, turned him away. The notion of marching 3 months inland to fight the master of Asia struck the Spartans as madness, and in this they were wiser than they knew. But Athens, young Athens, newborn to its democracy, hot with the pride of having just thrown off its own tyrants and beaten back its neighbors, Athens listened. The assembly voted to send ships. 20 of them, with 5 more from the little city of Eretria. It was a small gesture, a handful of vessels, and Herodotus, who told this tale long after, remarked dryly that those 20 ships were the beginning of troubles for both Greeks and barbarians alike. For with those ships, the Ionians and their Athenian allies marched inland and did a thing that could never be undone. They came upon Sardis, the great Persian regional capital, the seat of the satrap, the old golden city of Croesus, and they burned it. The flames took hold in the reed-thatched houses and leapt from roof to roof until the whole lower town was ablaze, and even the temple of the local goddess was consumed. The Greeks did not hold the city, they fell back to the coast, harried and beaten on the way. In the cold reckoning of war, the raid achieved almost nothing. But it achieved everything, in the way that matters to a story. For word of it travelled the royal road, swift as those tireless couriers, all the way to Susa, and it was laid before the great king. And Darius, ruler of half the known world, asked who these Athenians were, these people from a place he could scarcely find on his maps, who had dared to put his city to the torch. And when he had been told, the tale goes that he took his bow and shot an arrow high into the air, and prayed to his God that he might be granted vengeance upon Athens. And then he did a stranger thing still. He commanded one of his servants to stand beside him at dinner, every single day, and to say to him 3 times, quietly, as the dishes were laid, "Master, remember the Athenians." Far to the west, the little city by the sea went about its business, its citizens voting in the sunlight, unaware that a king at the edge of the world had learned their name by heart, and would not forget it. The summer of 490 BC came slowly to the coast of Attica, the way summers always did there, with the light turning thick and golden over the olive groves and the sea lying flat and blue as beaten metal. And it was across that flat blue water that the ships came. Not a rumor of ships this time, not a story carried by a frightened messenger, but the ships themselves, hundreds of them, their sails filling the horizon like a slow tide of dark cloth. They came from the island of Euboea, where the city of Eretria had already been burned and its people led away in chains, and they steered south along the coast until they found what they were looking for, a wide crescent of shore, sheltered and gentle, with good ground behind it for horses and a marsh at its northern edge where the reeds grew tall. The place was called Marathon. It meant, in the old tongue, the plain of fennel, for the herb grew wild there, and if you had walked its length that summer you might have crushed a stem beneath your sandal and smelled that sweet green scent rising even as the Persian army came ashore. They came ashore in their thousands. Persians and Medes, Saki from the far steppes, archers whose bows could darken the sky, cavalry whose horses had been carried across the whole width of the sea in the bellies of the ships. And they had brought with them an old man, a Greek, white-haired and bitter and long exiled, Hippias, once the tyrant of Athens, driven out years before, who had spent his old age nursing a single hope, that a great king might one day set him back upon the city that had cast him out. It was Hippias who had chosen this beach. He knew the land. He had played here, perhaps, as a boy. And now he limped along the shingle in the service of Persia, pointing out the ground, dreaming of the gates of Athens opening to him at last. Word of the landing reached the city on the far side of the mountains, and Athens did a thing that must have seemed, to the watching gods, almost absurd in its smallness. It gathered its citizens. Not a professional army, not a horde of hired spears, but its own men, potters and farmers and shipwrights, the same men who voted in the sunlight, who now took down from the walls of their houses the bronze and the ashwood spear and walked out to meet the largest empire the world had ever known. There were perhaps 10,000 of them, with a few hundred more from the little town of Plataea, who came because Athens had once helped them and they would not forget it. And that was all. They marched over the shoulder of the hills and looked down onto the plain of fennel, and saw the sea black with ships and the shore alive with the enemy, and they did not go down. Not yet. They made their camp in the foothills, among the trees, in the shade, and they waited. They had sent, before all this, a runner to Sparta, a man named Phidippides, a trained long-distance courier, who ran the whole brutal length of the Peloponnese in 2 days to beg the Spartans for aid. And the Spartans, who were the finest soldiers in all of Greece, said that they would come. But they were in the middle of a sacred festival, and their law forbade them to march until the moon was full. So they would come, only later. Only after. And so Athens stood at Marathon knowing that the bravest allies it had were counting the nights until the moon, and that the fight, if it came, would be theirs alone. For days nothing happened. The two armies watched each other across the plain, and the waiting itself became a kind of wait. Among the 10 generals of Athens there was disagreement, fierce and whispered. Some wished to wait for Sparta, some to strike now, and the man who wanted to strike was named Miltiades. He knew the Persians. He had lived among them once, served them, watched them fight. He understood that their strength was in their archers and their horse, and that if a man could only get in close, fast, before the arrows found their range, the thing might yet be done. He argued and he pleaded, and at last the decision fell to him. And one morning, in the thin light after dawn, when for some reason the Persian cavalry was not upon the field, Miltiades gave the order. They had thinned their center to stretch their line so that the enemy could not curl around their flanks, and they had crowded their strength onto the wings. And then, across nearly a mile of open ground, the whole Athenian line began to run. Grown men in bronze, shields on their arms, spears leveled, running, the Persians watching them come could scarcely believe it, this little army with no cavalry and no archers hurling itself forward as though it wished to die. The arrows came, and men fell, but the line did not break, and it did not slow. You can feel it, perhaps, even now, if you let yourself, the drum of 10,000 feet on the dry earth, the fennel crushed and scattered, the breath tearing, the terrible closing of the gap. And then the crash of it, bronze against wicker, spear against flesh, the whole plain dissolving into dust and shouting. In the center, where the line was thin, the Athenians gave way, and the Persians pressed forward, sure of their victory. But that was the trap of it, though no one had quite planned it so. On both wings the Athenians held and then broke their enemy, and instead of chasing the fleeing men across the plain, the two victorious wings turned inward, wheeled like closing jaws, and fell upon the Persian center from either side. Now it was the great army that panicked. They ran for the ships, back across the plain, back toward the sea, and there at the northern edge the reeds and the black water of the marsh took hold of them, and men in heavy dress floundered and drowned in the mud within sight of safety. By the time the sun was high the beach was a slaughter and the ships were pulling away half empty. Some 6,000 of the Persians lay dead upon the fennel. Of the Athenians, 192. They would bury them there, beneath a mound of earth that you can still walk to today, a soft green hill on a quiet plain. And there is a story, told and retold until no one can say where the truth of it ends and the longing begins, that a runner was sent from the field to carry the news home to the anxious city. That he ran the whole way without stopping, in his armor, under the climbing sun, his heart hammering against the bronze. That he burst at last into the gathered assembly of Athens, the men who did not yet know whether their world had ended, and cried out a single word, Nenikaikamen, we have won, and then fell down and died where he stood, having spent the very last of himself to carry a joy too large to keep. It may not have happened. The oldest tellings do not have it. But something in the story would not be let go of, because something true was hiding inside it, that on that morning ordinary men had run across a plain of fennel and thrown back the greatest power on earth, and that the news of it was worth a life. Yet even as the city wept and rejoiced, and the burial mound rose over the fallen, the wiser heads among them looked out to the empty sea and did not quite let themselves believe it was over. For a king at the edge of the world had sworn an oath, and a servant still whispered to him at every meal. Darius had lost a battle. He had not lost his memory. And somewhere far to the east, the counting of the ships had only just begun again. 10 years is a long time to a man, and no time at all to an empire. Darius did not live to keep his oath, the counting of the ships outlasted him, and the throne passed to his son, and the son took up the grudge the way a man takes up an inheritance he never asked for but cannot refuse. Xerxes was his name, and where his father had sent a fleet, he would bring the world. For 3 years the roads of Asia were loud with it. Men came down from the highlands and up from the river valleys, from Egypt and Lydia and the far grasslands where horses were counted like coin, until the tongues of the army no longer understood one another and only the whips spoke a language everyone knew. When at last they reached the water that divides one continent from another, Xerxes did a thing that men would tell of for 1,000 years. He laid a bridge of boats across the strait, lashed prow to prow, and marched an army over the sea as though the sea were merely one more subject who had forgotten to kneel. The story says a storm broke the first bridge, and that the king, in his fury, ordered the water itself to be whipped 300 times and branded with hot irons, as one might punish a slave. Whether it happened or not, the meaning was plain enough. Here was a power that did not think of nature as a limit. It thought of everything as a thing to be crossed. And the Greeks, hearing of it, did what Greeks so often did. They argued. Some cities sent earth and water to the king's heralds, the old tokens of submission, and were spared. Some sent nothing and prepared to die. And a handful, meeting in council, looked at the long shape of their own country, the mountains that ran down close to the shore, the passes where a road narrowed to a thread, and understood that their only hope was to make the vastness of the enemy count for nothing. You cannot fight a flood in the open field. But you can dam it if you find the right narrow place. There was such a place in the north, where the cliffs of a mountain leaned down almost to the sea and left only a strip of road between the rock and the water, no wider in one spot than a single cart. The hot springs there gave it its name. Thermopylae, the Greeks called it. The hot gates. To that gate came Leonidas, one of the 2 kings of Sparta, with 300 of his own men and some thousands more gathered from other cities along the way. It was, everyone knew, too few. There was a festival on at home that forbade the army to march in full, and an oracle had spoken darkly of a king's death, and perhaps Leonidas chose his 300 already half knowing what the choosing meant, for the story tells that he took only men who had sons living, so that no house would end that week upon the road. They mended the old wall across the pass. They oiled their limbs and combed their long hair in the sun, and when a scout of the king's rode close to look, he found them at it, calm as men before a games, and could not understand what he saw. Xerxes could not understand it either. He waited for days for so small a company to grow sensible and run. On the 5th, he sent his men in to take them. And the narrow place did its work. Down that thread of road the great army could bring only as many men as the width allowed, and those men met a wall of long spears and heavy shields held by soldiers who had trained since boyhood for exactly this and nothing else. The Persians came in their thousands and died in their hundreds, packed too close to swing, driven from behind onto the points in front. Even the king's own picked guard, the 10,000 men called the Immortals because their number never fell, for each one slain was replaced before the ranks could notice the gap, even they were thrown back bleeding. Twice that day Xerxes is said to have leapt up from the throne he had set upon the hillside to watch his victory, and twice he sat back down in fear for his army. The pass held. The sea beside it held too, for out past the headland at Artemisium the Greek ships lay across the strait and traded blow for blow with a fleet that should have swallowed them, while storms off the Cape did what the outnumbered captains could not and dashed whole squadrons of the king's navy onto the rocks in the dark. For 2 days and more, on the water and on the road, the flood pressed against the dam and the dam did not break. It broke, as such things so often do, not by force but by a whisper. There lived in that country a man named Ephialtes, and he knew what the king would have paid a kingdom to learn, that the mountain wall was not truly a wall, that a goat path wound up through the oaks and over the shoulder of the heights and came down again behind the pass, behind the Greeks, behind everything. For gold, or for whatever it is that moves a man to sell the ground he was born on, he told the king. And in the night the Immortals went up the hidden way by torchlight, over the leaves, past a small guard that scattered before them, and by dawn they stood above and behind the hot gates, and the trap that Leonidas had made of the pass had been quietly made into a trap around him. He knew it early. the lookouts came running down from the heights, and the seers read the morning offerings and spoke of death, and there was time still, in that grey hour, to march away and live. Most did. Leonidas sent the other cities' men off down the road while the road was open, whether because he judged them of more use alive or because he would not spend lives that were not Spartan to spend. But he himself stayed, and his 300 stayed, and a few others who would not leave stayed with them, and they ate what the story calls their last breakfast, with the king's grim little jest still hanging in the air, that they should eat well, for that night they would dine in the world below. When the Persians came on that final morning, they came from both sides at once, and the Spartans went out beyond the wall into the wider ground to sell themselves as dearly as flesh could be sold. Their spears broke and they fought with swords, their swords broke and they fought with hands and teeth, the tellers say, until the arrows came down on them like a roof closing over a room, so many that the sun itself was said to be shadowed, and the last of them fell upon a little hill above the road, and the gate was open, and the flood came through. They had held 6 or 7 days out of the whole vast campaign. It does not sound like much. But every one of those days was a day the cities to the south were not yet burning, a day in which frightened men made hard choices, launched ships, argued and delayed, and slowly, grudgingly, began to believe that the impossible thing might yet be resisted, because 300 men in a mountain pass had shown them, plainly and terribly, what resistance looked like. The fleet at Artemisium slipped away in good order when the news came, back down the coast toward the islands and the narrow waters near the great city itself. And the great city, Athens, the pride and the target of the whole enterprise, now lay open before the marching host with almost nothing left between its walls and the fire. Its people gathered in the marketplace to ask the only question that mattered, and the answer, when the oracle gave it, spoke of a wall of wood, a riddle no one yet knew how to read. There is a moment, in the days after Thermopylae, when the great city of Athens becomes very quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a place emptying itself. Word had come down the coast that the pass was lost, that the fleet at Artemisium had slipped away, and that nothing now stood between the marching host of the Persian king and the temples on the high rock at the center of the town. And so the people of Athens did a thing that must have felt like a small death. They abandoned their home. They put their mothers and their children and their old people into boats and carried them across the water to the island of Salamis, and to the shores of the Peloponnese, and to the little island of Aegina. They left the houses where they had been born. They left the shrines of their grandfathers. And they carried with them almost nothing but the belief, still fragile, still barely spoken aloud, that a wall of wood might yet save them. For that was how Themistocles had chosen to read the oracle. When the priestess at Delphi had spoken of a wooden wall that alone would stand unfallen, some had thought she meant the old thorn hedge around the citadel, and a handful of stubborn men stayed behind to defend it with planks and prayers. But Themistocles, the sharp-tongued, far-seeing man who had spent years quietly turning Athenian silver into Athenian ships, told them the wall of wood was the fleet. It was the 200 triremes riding at anchor in the strait. And the people, having little else to trust, chose to trust him. So they watched from the island as the smoke rose. The Persians came into the empty city and took the high rock, and they burned the temples, and the great flames went up into the summer sky where every refugee across the water could see them. Imagine standing on the shore of Salamis in the failing light, a child asleep against your shoulder, watching the place you loved turn to fire on the far side of the sea. It would have felt, in that hour, like the end of everything. And perhaps that despair was exactly what the Persian king was counting on. But the strait itself was a strange and narrow water. Between the island of Salamis and the mainland the sea pinches close, a crooked channel hemmed in by headlands, no place at all for a great fleet to spread its wings. And it was into that channel that Themistocles meant to draw them. The Greek captains argued, of course. They always argued. Many of them wanted to fall back to the isthmus, to guard their own homes, to abandon the island and the ruined city to their fate. Through the long night the councils raged. And so, the old story tells us, Themistocles played a quieter game. He sent a trusted servant slipping across the dark water to the Persian camp with a whispered message that the Greeks were frightened, that they meant to flee before dawn, and that if the king wished to destroy them he should block the exits now, tonight, and catch them like fish in a shrinking net. It was a lie, and it was also a trap, and the king took it. Through the small hours the Persian fleet moved to seal the channel at both ends, the rowers bending to their oars in the darkness, sealing themselves in as surely as they sealed the Greeks. Xerxes had a throne carried up onto the slopes of Mount Aegaleus, on the mainland side, so that he could sit in the morning light and watch his ships win his war for him. He brought scribes to record the names of the captains who fought best. He expected a spectacle. He got one, but not the one he had imagined. When the dawn came grey over the water, the Greeks did not flee. They came out singing. There is a line remembered from that morning, a cry that went up from the Greek ships as they swung their prows toward the enemy. Sons of the Greeks, go free your fatherland, free your children and your wives, the shrines of your fathers' gods and the tombs of your ancestors, now the fight is for all of them. And then the oars bit the water and the long bronze rams came around. In the open sea the Persian numbers would have been overwhelming. But here, in the crooked narrow strait, numbers became a curse. The great fleet could not deploy. As the leading ships were checked and turned by the Greek rams, the ships behind them, pressing forward, blind to the trouble ahead, came crashing into their own line. Oars snapped against oars. Hulls fouled one another. The heavier Persian and Phoenician vessels lost the room they needed to maneuver, and the lighter, low Greek triremes darted among them, ramming amidships, backing water, striking again. The wind rose as the morning wore on and set a swell running down the channel that slewed the tall enemy ships broadside and left them helpless. What had been a mighty armada became a churning wreckage of splintered wood and drowning men, packed so close that the sea could scarcely be seen between the hulls. And the king watched all of it. That is the detail the old writers dwell on, and it is worth holding in the mind as you drift toward sleep. The most powerful man in the world, seated on a golden throne on a hillside, watching his invincible fleet break apart in a ditch of water he could not reach. When one of his own ships, they say, did something brave, he would ask its captain's name and have it written down, but the writing down could not change the shape of the strait, or the wind, or the cold arithmetic of a trap sprung shut. By evening the sea was strewn with wreckage and the survivors were rowing hard for the open water, and the invasion that had crossed a continent to swallow Greece had been broken on a single afternoon's tide. Xerxes did not linger. The season was turning, and a king cut off from the sea in a hostile land is a king in danger. He gathered up the greater part of his army and marched back the long way he had come, back across the bridged Hellespont before the winter storms could sever his road home. But he did not take everything with him. He left behind his finest general, a man named Mardonius, and a great picked army to winter in the north of Greece and finish, in the coming year, what the fleet had failed to finish. So the war was not over. It only slept, as the land slept under the winter gathering itself. And when the spring of the following year came round, Mardonius came south again with his host, and once more the Athenians left their rebuilt homes, and once more the Greek cities set aside their endless quarrels long enough to put an army into the field together, the largest army the Greek world had ever raised. They met the Persians on the broad plain near a little town called Plataea, in the shadow of the mountains, and there, after days of wary maneuvering across the dry summer ground, the long struggle came at last to its end. The Spartan phalanx broke the Persian center. Mardonius fell. And the great army that Xerxes had left to conquer Greece was scattered and destroyed, and the invasion was over, truly over, forever. And so the Greeks looked up, when the dust had settled, and found themselves still standing, a small, stubborn, quarrelsome cluster of cities that had somehow turned back the greatest empire on earth. They had burned and buried and wept, and they had won, and nothing about them would ever be quite the same again. For victory, as they would soon discover, is its own kind of danger. The men who had rowed at Salamis would want their reward. The city that had led the fleet would grow hungry for something more than survival. And in the glow of that triumph, among the ashes of the old world, a new and prouder Athens was already beginning to stir. The Persians were gone, and Athens stood in the wreckage of its own burning, and looked around, and did not weep for long. There is a kind of city that mourns, and a kind of city that builds, and Athens, in the years after Salamis, discovered that it was the second kind. The men who had rowed at the oars, packed shoulder to shoulder in the bellies of the triremes, came home with salt in their beards and a new certainty in their bones, that they, the poor and the ordinary, had saved Greece with their arms and their backs, and that they would not quietly return to being nobody. And so the city turned outward, into the wine-dark Aegean, where dozens of smaller islands and coastal towns still lived in fear that the great king might one day return. "Come together," Athens said. "Pull your ships, your silver, your men. Let us build a shield of the whole sea." And they gathered on the little sacred island of Delos, birthplace of Apollo, and swore their oaths, and dropped bars of iron into the water, vowing that the alliance would last until the iron floated again. They called it the Delian League. It sounded, at the start, like a brotherhood of equals. But listen to how a shield becomes a fist. In the beginning the allies gave ships, or they gave money to build ships, and slowly, year by year, most of them found it easier to give money. Athens, after all, had the shipyards, the timber, the crews, the skill. Why should a small island keep a navy of its own when it could simply pay, and let the great city do the sailing? And so the fleets of the allies dwindled, and the fleet of Athens grew, until one day a city looked up and realized it had no ships of its own left to leave with, and that leaving was no longer allowed. When Naxos tried to withdraw, Athens besieged it, and brought it back by force. The brotherhood had quietly become an empire, and the tribute that had been offered freely was now collected like a tax. And then, in a single decision that changed everything, the treasury itself, all that silver, gathered from 100 cities in the name of defense, was lifted from the sacred island of Delos and carried to Athens, to be kept, they said, more safely. It would never leave again. Into this moment stepped a man who would give the whole age his name. Pericles was not loud. He was cool, deliberate, almost aloof, a tall aristocrat with a strangely long head that his enemies loved to mock, who spoke rarely in the assembly but, when he did, seemed to command the storm itself. For 30 years he was, in all but title, the first man of Athens, chosen again and again by the votes of the very common people whose power he had helped to build. And Pericles made a decision that men would argue about for centuries. That imperial treasure, wrung from the allies, gleaming in the temples of Athens, he would spend it. Not on ships this time, not on war. He would spend it on beauty. He would rebuild the Acropolis, the sacred rock at the city's heart, which the Persians had burned to blackened stumps, and he would make of it something the world had never seen. "Let the allies complain," he said, "that we adorn our city like a vain woman decked in jewels. So long as we defend them, we owe them no account of how the surplus is spent." And the marble began to move. Picture the rock in those years, not the silent ruin you might imagine, but a hillside loud with work, dust hanging gold in the afternoon light. Ox carts hauling blocks of Pentelic marble, quarried from the mountain to the north, marble so pure it holds a faint honeyed glow when the sun strikes it, and warms toward rose as the day fades. Hundreds of hands, masons and carpenters, gilders and painters, rope makers and muleteers, a whole city fed by a single vision. Over it all presided Phidias, the greatest sculptor of the age, Pericles' friend and the master of the works, and the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, who bent their minds to a temple for the goddess Athena, the Parthenon. And here is the quiet wonder of it. To the eye it seems built of perfect straight lines. It is not. There is scarcely a true straight line in the whole building. The floor swells gently upward toward its center, the columns lean almost imperceptibly inward, and swell at their middle, and stand a little closer together at the corners, every one of these a deliberate, subtle curve, calculated to correct the tricks the eye plays, so that the finished temple would look more perfectly straight than straight itself could ever appear. Stone-shaped to flatter the human eye. And within, when it was done, Phidias raised his masterpiece, Athena herself, nearly 40 feet tall, sheathed in ivory and gold, serene above the city that had made her. And while the marble rose, so did something harder to carve, the life of the mind, spilling over in these decades as if the whole city had been uncorked. Down the slope of the Acropolis, on the southern side, the theatre of Dionysus filled each spring with thousands of citizens, come to watch new plays performed for the first time. There sat the old soldier Aeschylus, who had actually stood in the line at Marathon and would ask to be remembered for that, not for his verse, Aeschylus, who took the drama and gave it a second actor, and then a third, and turned ritual into human conflict. There followed Sophocles, calm and beloved, who gave the world Oedipus and Antigone, a man torn between the law of the city and the law of the heart. And after him Euripides, stranger and more unsettling, who put the doubts and cruelties and the wounded women of the age onto the stage and made the audience uneasy in their seats. Comedy too, savage and gleeful, mocking the very statesman who sat watching. And walking the same streets, gathering stories from every port he had ever sailed to, was Herodotus, a curious, generous, endlessly digressive traveler from Halicarnassus who set out simply to record why the Greeks and the Persians had come to blows, and in doing so more or less invented the writing of history itself. He wanted, he said, that the great deeds of men should not be forgotten, nor fade with the passing of time. This was the high noon of the tale. If you had climbed the Acropolis on an evening in those years and turned to look outward, over the crowded roofs, past the long walls that ran down to the harbor at Piraeus, out to the masts of the greatest fleet in the world, you might have believed that Athens had solved the oldest problem of all, how to be both powerful and beautiful, both feared and admired, at once. The tribute flowed in. The marble climbed. The plays were written, and the crowds wept, and the philosophers argued in the shade. It felt, and it looked, and for a while it truly was, like the summit of the human story. But there is a shadow in every noon, and it lies precisely beneath the thing that casts it. All that beauty stood on tribute, and tribute is only another word for the resentment of the paying. Far across the water, in a stern valley to the south, another city watched Athens grow, a city with no marble temples and no theatres, a city that measured itself not in gold but in spears. Sparta had led Greece in the war, and now it saw a younger rival rising to eclipse it, greedy for the sea and the coin and the glory. Two great powers, one restless and brilliant, the other proud and afraid. And slowly, like a tide you cannot see move until it has already reached your feet, the space between them was filling with something colder than rivalry, something that only needed a spark. And so the spark came, as sparks always do, from something smaller than the fire it starts. A quarrel over distant cities, Corsa afar to the west, Potidaea in the north, a trade embargo laid upon little Megara that pinched its markets shut. None of these, on their own, was worth the ruin of the Greek world. But behind each of them stood the same unspoken truth, the one Thucydides would set down years later with the cold clarity of a man who had seen it all fail. What made the war inevitable, he wrote, was the growth of Athenian power, and the fear that this caused in Sparta. Everything else was only the occasion. The fear was the cause. In the spring of 431 before our era, a company of the band slipped through the gates of a small allied town in the dark, and the long peace, which had never been more than a held breath, was finally let go. Sparta and her allies gathered their spears. And Pericles, who had guided Athens for 30 years with that grave, unhurried voice, stood before his people and told them a thing that must have sounded almost like madness. "Do not go out to meet them," he said. Do not fight the Spartans on the land, where they are lions and we are not. Let them come. Let them burn the fields. We will bring everyone inside the walls, and we will let the sea feed us. For Athens had a secret shape that most cities did not. She was not one city but two, joined by a spine of stone. Down from the height of the Acropolis, across 4 miles of open country to the harbour at Piraeus, ran the long walls, 2 vast parallel ramparts, a fortified corridor that connected the city to the sea and made the two of them a single, unbreakable body. So long as the fleet ruled the water, no army on earth could starve Athens out. The grain ships would come from the Black Sea. The tribute would come from the empire. The Spartans might tramp through Attica and set torches to the olive groves, and the Athenians would stand on their walls and watch the smoke rise over their own farms, and do nothing, and outlast them. It was a cold strategy, and a wise one, and it asked of the Athenians the hardest thing of all, to see their homes burn and keep still. They did it. That first summer, the Spartan king Archidamus led his host into Attica and ravaged the land, and the country people came streaming in through the gates with their carts and their children and their household gods, crowding into every empty space between the walls, sleeping in the towers, in the sanctuaries, in the narrow strip of no man's land along that 4-mile corridor to the sea. And when the campaigning season ended and the enemy went home, the Athenians did what they had always done for their war dead. They gathered the bones of the fallen, and they held the public funeral, the old solemn rite, and they chose one man to speak the words over them. They chose Pericles. What he said that day has outlived the walls, and the empire, and the bones themselves. He did not dwell long on the dead. Instead he spoke of the city they had died for, of a place, he said, that did not copy its neighbors but was a pattern to them, where power rested in the hands of the many and not the few, where a man was judged by what he could do and not by the class he came from, where poverty was no bar to service and no shame to admit. We love beauty, he told them, but without extravagance, and we love wisdom, but without softness. Our city is open to the world. We throw our gates wide and trust to our own courage rather than to secrets and stratagems. And each single one of us, he said, could turn his hand to the most varied kinds of action, and do it with grace, and ease, and a natural charm. This is why we fight. Not for stones and harbors, but for this, a way of living together that is worth dying to keep. Fix your eyes on the greatness of Athens, he said, until you are filled with the love of her. This was the summit speaking of itself, at the very edge of its noon, not yet knowing the shadow was already lengthening at its feet. Because they were too many now, those thousands crammed inside the walls. The country folk who had fled the Spartan torches were living packed together in the summer heat, in stifling huts and shelters, without clean water, without air, breathing one another's breath. And in the second summer of the war, something came into the harbor on the ships, down from Egypt, they said, out of Ethiopia beyond it, and moved from Piraeus up the long corridor into the crowded city, and began, quietly at first, to kill. We do not know for certain what it was. Thucydides, who caught it himself and lived, set down its every symptom with the terrible patience of a witness who wanted no one ever to be caught unknowing again. It began in the head, he wrote, a burning in the eyes, the throat and tongue turning bloody, the breath coming foul. Then the sneezing and the hoarseness, and it sank into the chest with a hard cough, and then into the stomach, and the body burned so fiercely from within that the sufferers could not bear even the lightest linen upon them, and longed above all to throw themselves into cold water. Many who were not watched crept to the wells and the fountains and died there, still drinking, their thirst never slaked. And the birds and beasts that fed on the dead would not touch these bodies, or died themselves if they did. But it was not the symptoms that broke the city. It was what the dying did to the living. When people saw that the careful and the reckless perished just the same, that the gods heard no prayer and the doctors knew no cure, something came loose in the soul of Athens. men who had guarded their honor all their lives now spent freely on pleasure, reasoning that life and money were both things of a day. No fear of God or law of man held anyone back, when the pious and the wicked were dying side by side and no one expected to live long enough to be called to account. The bodies lay heaped in the streets and about the springs. The rites of burial, so sacred to the Greeks, fell into ruin. Men flung their dead onto strangers' pyres and slipped away. It was, Thucydides wrote, the beginning of a lawlessness in the city, this plague, as though the sickness of the body had spread inward and become a sickness of the whole way of living that Pericles had praised. And Pericles himself was not spared. He had lost his sister to it, and his sons, the 2 young men of his own blood, and it is said that when he laid the funeral wreath on the last of them, the old statesman who had never wept in public wept then, and could not speak. In the autumn of the war's 3rd year the plague reached him too, and it did not kill him with the quick fever it gave the others, but wore him slowly down, guttering the great light out over long weeks. And in that same season he died, the man who had built the long walls, and the temples on the hill, and the whole audacious idea that a city could be governed by its people and still be great. He left behind a war he had promised they could win, an empire held together by fear and tribute, and a people no longer quite themselves. Thucydides watched it all, and wrote it down, and asked the quiet, unbearable question that the rest of the war would spend a generation trying to answer. Athens still had her fleet, her walls, her wealth, her thousands. She had lost only the one voice that had known how to hold all of it steady. And you might wonder, as the survivors surely did, standing among the ashes of that second summer, who would take up such a city now, and where, without that steady hand upon it, all that restless brilliance would carry them next. Listen, then, for the war did not end with the great man's passing. It went on, not as a single battle, but as a long, grey erosion, a thing measured not in seasons but in decades, and you would be forgiven for losing the thread of it, as the Athenians themselves nearly did. There were truces that held for a while and then quietly failed. There were years when the plague-thin city seemed almost to recover its breath, and years when it did not. And through it all, that quiet, unbearable question that Thucydides had asked kept answering itself, slowly, in blood and silver and the names of far-off islands. One of those names was Melos. It was a small place, a Dorian island in the southern Aegean, no threat to anyone, wishing only to be left alone, neutral, it said, in a war it had not started. But Athens, in the 16th year of the fighting, had grown into something harder than the city of Pericles' funeral speech. She sent her ships, and she sent her envoys, and what passed between them and the Melians has come down to us as one of the coldest conversations ever written. The Athenians did not argue that they were right. They argued only that they were strong, and that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The Melians appealed to justice, to the gods, to hope. The Athenians answered that hope was an expensive comfort, and that they had come not to debate but to inform. And when the little island refused to kneel, the siege closed around it, and in the end the Athenians did a terrible thing. They killed the men of Melos, all those of fighting age, and sold the women and children into slavery, and settled the empty island with their own colonists. It was the sort of thing empires do when they have stopped asking whether they should. And you may notice, drifting toward sleep, how far the city had traveled from the temples on the hill, how a people can keep all its cleverness and lose, somewhere along the road, the thing that had made the cleverness worth trusting. That same restless brilliance, with no steady hand upon it, was already reaching for something far larger than Melos. Away to the west, across the sea, lay Sicily, rich, populous, golden with grain, and crowned by the great city of Syracuse, itself a colony grown mighty. And into the Athenian assembly came a young man to argue that they should take it. His name was Alcibiades, and he is one of those figures history keeps because he is impossible to look away from. He was beautiful, and he knew it. He was rich, and he spent it like water. He was Socrates' most dazzling pupil and his most wayward. He wore his cloak trailing in the dust and won chariot races at Olympia by the fistful, and he could make a crowd believe almost anything while he was speaking to it. He told the Athenians that Sicily was ripe, that the West would fall to them, that a city which stopped expanding began to die. And the wiser voices, the cautious General Nicias chief among them, warned that it was folly, that they were sailing into the unknown against a foe they did not understand. But the city was hungry for glory, and it did not listen. So in the summer of 415 before our era, the greatest fleet Athens had ever launched gathered in the harbor of Piraeus. Picture it, if it helps you toward rest, the painted ships drawn up rank on rank, the sails, the gilded prows, the whole population lining the shore in the early light, prayers poured out from golden cups, a single trumpet sounding across the water, and then the long-ordered ranks pulling out to sea to the sound of the paean sung by thousands of voices at once. It was magnificent. It was also, though no one there could see it, the beginning of the end. For before the great expedition could even reach its work, Alcibiades, the man who had dreamed it, was recalled to stand trial on a charge of impiety at home, some drunken sacrilege against the sacred statues of the city. And rather than return to face it, he slipped away. He went, of all places, to Sparta. There he sat among Athens' enemies and told them, coolly, everything they needed to know, how to hurt his own city, where she was weak, what she feared. He counseled them to send a commander to Syracuse and to fortify a point in Attica itself that would bleed Athens all year round. He changed sides as easily as changing a cloak, and the men he betrayed had trusted him utterly. He was a marvel and a ruin, both, and the war would carry him back and forth across its map like a leaf on a flood. And in Sicily, without him, the great venture came apart. Nicias, cautious to the point of paralysis and sick besides, hesitated when he should have struck. The siege of Syracuse dragged. The defenders, stiffened by a hard Spartan officer, fought back and did not break. Reinforcements came from Athens and were swallowed. And when at last the Athenians tried to force the harbor, the wide bay of Syracuse became a trap, too many ships in too small a water, unable to maneuver, crashing hull against hull while the whole city watched from the shore and howled. The fleet was broken there. And the army that remained, tens of thousands of men, tried to escape overland, marching inland under the sun, harried the whole way, dying of thirst at a river that ran red before they could drink from it. The survivors were herded into the stone quarries of Syracuse and left to rot in the heat and the cold, and the flower of an entire generation of Athens was lost, far from home, in a foreign ground. When the news reached the city, it is said the people would not believe it, that a man heard it first from a stranger in a barber's shop, and no one credited him. But it was true. The armada was gone. After that, the wonder is not that Athens fell but that she stood so long. She built new ships from nothing. She won battles she had no right to win. She endured revolution within her own walls and endured it again. Alcibiades came back to her, dazzling as ever, and led her fleet, and was cast off once more. And slowly, year upon grinding year, the money ran out, and the allies fell away, and Sparta, now with Persian gold behind her, of all things, learned at last to fight upon the sea. The final blow fell at a place called Aegospotami, on the Hellespont, where the Athenian fleet was caught beached and unready and taken almost without a fight. And with her ships gone, the city that lived by grain from across the sea could not be fed. Sparta did not need to storm her. Sparta had only to wait, and close the straits, and let hunger do the work. So in the spring of 404 before our era, 27 years after that first bright summer, Athens surrendered. The terms were these: give up the fleet, give up the empire, and tear down the long walls, those same walls that Themistocles had raised in secret and Pericles had made the spine of the city, the corridor of stone that had joined Athens to the sea and made her invincible so long as she held it. And they were pulled down. It is said the Spartans and their allies broke the great walls to the music of flute girls, as though at a festival, believing that day to be the first day of the freedom of Greece. The dust rose over the ruined stone in the spring light, and the city that had ruled the sea sat behind an open wound where her walls had been, and was, for the first time in living memory, a small thing among larger powers. And yet, as the flutes played and the stones came down, some among the watchers must have wondered what would rise in the silence that followed, for a city may lose her fleet and her walls and her empire, and still, somewhere in her ruined streets, keep the one dangerous gift that no siege can carry off, the habit of asking what it all had meant, and whether a free people, having fallen so far, might yet have something left to teach the world. The city that had lost her walls did not, at first, know what to do with her defeat. For a generation Athens had been the school of Greece, the eye of the sea, and now she sat behind an open wound of tumbled stone, her fleet gone, her tribute gone, her confidence gone with them. The democracy had been overthrown by the 30 tyrants, propped up by Sparta, and had drowned in blood. Then it had risen again, restored, weary, suspicious of itself. And in the narrow streets, among the returning exiles and the men who had betrayed them and the men who had merely survived, there walked an old man with a broad flat face and a snubbed nose and bare feet, who would not stop asking questions. He was past 70 now. He had fought at Delium and Potidæa in his younger years, standing firm in the line when others broke. He had spent the long decades since standing in a different kind of line, in the agora, in the porches and the wrestling schools, stopping the confident and the powerful and the young, and asking them, gently, maddeningly, what they meant when they used the great words. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? And discovering, with them, that they did not know. His name was Socrates, and he wrote nothing down. That is the first strange thing to hold in the quiet of the night. The man who stands at the fountainhead of Western philosophy left not a single line of his own. Everything we have of him comes to us at second hand, through the memory of those who loved him, most of all through a young aristocrat named Plato, who was perhaps 28 when the trial came, and who would spend the rest of his life setting his teacher down in dialogue after dialogue, so that the questioning voice might never quite fall silent. What Socrates truly said, and what Plato later made him say, we can no longer wholly separate. The historian must sit with that uncertainty, as with a lamp seen through mist. But the shape of the thing is clear enough, and it is one of the great scenes of the ancient world. In the spring of the year we call 399 before the Common Era, 3 citizens brought a formal charge against him. Meletus, a minor poet, Anytus, a wealthy tanner and a leading man of the restored democracy, and Lycon, an orator. The indictment was written in the plain, terrible language of the law. Socrates was guilty of impiety, of not believing in the gods the city believed in, and of introducing new divinities of his own. And he was guilty of corrupting the young. Beneath those words lay years of resentment. Some of his brightest pupils had turned against Athens. Alcibiades, brilliant and treacherous, had gone over to Sparta. Critias, cruelest of the 30 tyrants, had studied at his side. In the exhausted city, a teacher who taught the young to question everything, who made the powerful look foolish in front of crowds, was a wound that had never healed. He was, perhaps, a man being tried for a whole generation's grief. Picture the court. Not a solemn chamber but an open space in the morning air, and a jury of 500 citizens drawn by lot, ordinary men, potters and farmers and shopkeepers, seated on wooden benches, holding the small bronze tokens they would cast to acquit or condemn. The prosecutors spoke first, their words measured out by a water clock, the slow drip marking the limit of each man's time. Then the old man rose to answer for his life. And he would not do what a man on trial was supposed to do. He did not weep. He did not bring his little sons before the jury to soften their hearts, as was the custom. He did not flatter. Instead he told them, in that patient conversational voice, that he was the wisest man in Greece only because he alone knew that he knew nothing, that a god at Delphi had said as much, and he had spent his life trying to prove the god wrong, and failing, and finding only that the men who claimed to know were emptiest of all. He told them he was a gadfly sent to sting a great and sluggish horse into life, and that if they killed him they would not easily find another. It was not a defense. It was a last lesson, and they heard it as insolence. They found him guilty, but not by much, a few dozen votes the other way, and he would have walked free. Then, by the law of Athens, he was allowed to propose his own penalty against the death the prosecutors sought. Here any sensible man would have offered exile, or a heavy fine, and been quietly let go. Socrates suggested, at first, that the city ought to reward him, to feed him at public expense in the great hall, as it fed its Olympic victors, since he had given Athens something finer than any foot race. Only then, half in jest, prompted by his frightened friends, did he name a fine. The jury, insulted, condemned him to death by a wider margin than they had convicted him. He had, it seems, chosen. He would rather die as himself than live as someone the city could forgive. The execution did not come at once. A sacred ship had sailed for the island of Delos on a yearly religious voyage, and while it was away no death sentence could be carried out. So for perhaps a month the old man sat in prison, and his friends came each day, and there was time to talk, which was the only thing he had ever wanted. They urged him to escape, the guards could be bribed, the road to Thessaly lay open. He refused. He had lived his whole life under the laws of Athens, he said, taken their protection, raised his children by them, and it would be a shabby thing to break them now merely because they had turned against him. A man must not answer injustice with injustice. And so he stayed, and waited, and reasoned with his companions about whether the soul might outlast the body, until the ship came home. On the last day they gathered in the cell, Crito, and Phaedo, and the others, though Plato, he tells us carefully, was ill and not there, a small honest gap in the record. Socrates bathed, so the women would not have to wash his body afterward. He spoke with the jailer kindly, thanking him, for the man wept to bring the cup. At sunset the poison was carried in, ground from hemlock, and he took it without any change in his face and drank it down. He was told to walk until his legs grew heavy, and then to lie back. The cold crept upward from his feet, slowly, and he covered his face. Near the very end he uncovered it once more and spoke his last recorded words, a request that a small debt be paid, a cock he owed to Asclepius, the god of healing, as though dying were a kind of cure. Then he was still. His friends, who had held themselves together, wept at last for the best and wisest and most just, they said, of all the men they had known. Athens had killed her most troublesome son, and thought the matter closed. But the young men who had sat in that cell did not forget, and one of them would build, out of grief and memory, something the city could not execute. It is a quiet irony worth carrying into sleep. The empire that could command the sea is remembered now less for her triumphs than for the death of one barefoot old man who owned nothing and wrote nothing and simply refused to stop asking what was true. In the ruins of her power, Athens had made her most lasting gift, and the question that follows is a strange one. For if the city's greatness came only after her fall, what exactly had Plato carried out of that prison, and how had a handful of dialogues, written by a grieving pupil, outlived every wall and warship of the age? For a little while, after the long war with Sparta had ended, the cities of Greece went on as they always had, quarreling, shifting their alliances, believing that the balance of power that had held for centuries would hold a while longer. Sparta stood at the top of it now, her red-cloaked soldiers still spoken of in a hush, still imagined as something more than men. For generations no one had beaten a Spartan army drawn up in the open field. It was less a fact than a law of the world, the kind of thing a child learned early and never thought to question. And yet laws of that sort, however old, are only ever true until the morning they are not. That morning came on a plain in Boeotia, near a town called Leuctra, in the summer of 371 before our era. The Spartans marched north to punish Thebes, that stubborn city in the middle of Greece that had grown too proud, and they came in the old way, confident, arranged as they had always arranged themselves, the strongest men gathered on the right. Facing them stood a band general named Epaminondas, a quiet man, they say, poor by choice, more interested in philosophy than in glory, and precisely the sort of mind that looks at a law everyone obeys and asks why. He had noticed something simple. Every Greek army fought the same way, its best troops on the right, so that battles turned like two doors swinging on the same hinge. So he did the opposite. He stacked his own left wing impossibly deep, 50 shields from front to back, a hammer of men aimed straight at the Spartan king and his finest soldiers, and he held the rest of his line back, refusing battle where he was weak, striking with everything where he had chosen to be strong. It was over quickly. The great deep column of the bands rolled forward and simply crushed the Spartan right before the rest of the two armies had properly met. The king fell. Hundreds of full Spartan citizens fell with him, and there were never very many full Spartans to begin with, a brittle little aristocracy that could not easily replace its dead. In a single afternoon the spell of 3 centuries was broken. Sparta did not vanish, she limped on, smaller and more fearful, her subject peoples slipping free, her borders shrinking. But she was never again the terror of Greece. The thing that had made her powerful had partly been the belief that she could not be beaten, and now, on a summer plain, everyone had watched her beaten. You may find, as you drift, a strange sadness in it, how much of what seems eternal is only a story people have agreed to tell, and how a single ordinary day can end the telling. What followed was not the triumph of Thebes so much as the exhaustion of them all. The band's supremacy proved even briefer than Sparta's. Epaminondas himself was killed in another battle a few years later, at Mantinea, and with him died the only vision holding his city's greatness together. And so it went, city against city, alliance against alliance, Athens and Sparta and Thebes and a dozen lesser powers wheeling through the same weary quarrels they had fought for 100 years, each victory too costly to keep, each peace too thin to last. They had spent their strength on one another for so long that none of them had the strength left to notice something the histories now see very clearly, that while they exhausted themselves in the south, the real change was coming from the north, from a place they had always dismissed as half barbarian and beneath their attention. That place was Macedon. To the polished cities of the south it was a rough kingdom of hill farmers and horse lords, its Greek spoken with a coarse accent, its kings forever entangled in murder and civil war, a land you passed through on the way to somewhere that mattered. And then, in 359, its throne came to a young man named Philip, the second of that name, who had spent years of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, watching Epaminondas, learning at close hand exactly how a Greek army could be broken by a mind willing to break the rules. Philip took that lesson and built something new out of it. He gave his infantry a weapon the southern cities had never faced, the sarissa, a pike of ash wood some 5 meters long, so long it needed both hands to hold, so long that when a block of men lowered them together the front 5 ranks all projected their points beyond the leading man, a bristling hedge of iron that no ordinary spearman could reach through. He drilled these farmers until they moved as one body, wheeling and closing like a single animal, and he set beside them the finest cavalry in the Greek world, his Macedonian nobles, his companions, held back to strike the killing blow once the pikes had pinned an enemy in place. It was the anvil and the hammer, and it was patient, professional, unlike anything the citizen soldiers of the South, men who farmed most of the year and fought only in season, had ever had to meet. And Philip, who was as cunning in the council chamber as on the field, spent gold as freely as blood, buying traitors, marrying princesses, promising, threatening, dividing his enemies from one another so that they might never quite unite against him. Not everyone slept through it. In Athens there was a man named Demosthenes, a lawyer with a stammer he had beaten by shouting at the sea, who saw exactly what Philip was and could not make his countrymen believe him. Year after year he stood up in the assembly and warned them that this king in the north was not a distant nuisance but the end of their freedom, that every town he swallowed brought him closer, that the time to fight was now, while fighting was still possible. His speeches against Philip were so fierce that his very name for them, the Philippics, has meant a savage denunciation ever since. But warnings are a thin thing against comfort. The Athenians listened, and admired the speaking, and voted, and delayed, and told themselves there was still time, that the danger was surely being exaggerated, that a man could not truly mean to take everything. There is a particular quiet dread in watching a clear-eyed voice go unheeded, in knowing the words were right and the room chose not to hear them. At last, too late, the cities did rouse themselves. Athens and Thebes, old enemies, set aside their long hatred and joined their armies against the Macedonian, and in the summer of 338 the two sides met near a Boeotian town called Chaeronea. There the long pikes did their work, and there, on the Macedonian left, a young man of 18 led the cavalry charge that shattered the sacred band of Thebes, a prince named Alexander, of whom the world would hear a great deal more. When the day ended, the free cities of Greece had lost. Not one of them alone, but all of them together, in a single field. The old order, the world of the independent city, each its own small universe of citizens and gods and quarrels, the world that had lasted through all the centuries of this long story, was finished, and every city knew it. Philip was merciful in his way, gentle with Athens, careful with the pride of the defeated, for he did not want to rule ashes. He gathered the Greeks into a league under his own command and turned their eyes eastward, toward Persia, toward the old enemy across the sea. He would hold all the ancient cities in one hand now, from Macedon to the Peloponnese, a thing no man in all their history had ever done. And so the question that hangs over the dark, as sleep comes close, is what such a man intends to do with a whole nation gathered under him, and whether the great campaign he was already planning would be his to lead at all, or whether it would fall, by a knife in the dark, to that watchful young son who had ridden down the sacred band at 18. It happened at a wedding, of all places, in the theatre at Aegae where the old kings of Macedon were buried. Philip had gathered the whole of Greece to watch his daughter married, and he walked into the arena without his bodyguard, dressed in white, wanting the crowd to see that a king could stand among his people unafraid. The statues of the 12 gods went before him, and, some later said, a 13th had been added in his own likeness, as if he had begun to think himself something more than a man. He never reached his seat. A young officer of his own guard, a man named Pausanias who carried some private wound of his own, stepped out from the crowd and drove a short blade beneath his ribs, and Philip fell there on the sand in front of all the assembled Greeks, and the greatest soldier of his age was dead before the games had even begun. The murderer ran for the horses waiting at the gate, and was cut down before he could mount. And so the empire that Philip had spent a lifetime building, city by city and battle by battle, passed in a single afternoon into the hands of a boy of 20. You might imagine such a moment as chaos, and in truth the dark closed in fast around the young king. There were older men who thought the crown should be theirs, cousins and rivals who had waited long years for Philip to fall. There were the southern cities, Athens and Thebes among them, who heard of the death and felt the leash go slack, and began at once to whisper that now, surely, was the moment to be free. And there was the great campaign against Persia, already promised, already gathering, an army standing ready with no one certain who would lead it. Into all of this stepped Alexander, and what is remarkable, as you settle into the quiet of it, is how little he hesitated. He had his rivals removed with a cold and unsentimental speed. He marched south before the cities could organize, appearing at their gates so quickly that resistance simply dissolved, and the same league his father had built confirmed him in his father's place. He was, by any reckoning, still half a boy. But he had been raised for exactly this. For he had not been raised as ordinary princes were. When Alexander was 13, Philip had sent for the finest mind in the Greek world to be his tutor, and there came to the quiet groves outside the capital a philosopher named Aristotle, himself once a student of Plato, who had in turn learned from Socrates, so that the boy who would conquer the world was taught by the last of a line of the world's great thinkers. In a place called Mieza, among shaded walks and cool springs, the two of them read together. Aristotle gave him Homer, and Alexander took to the Iliad as though it were written for him alone, carrying a copy annotated in the philosopher's own hand, and sleeping, they say, with it and a dagger beneath his pillow. He learned medicine, and botany, and the shapes of the stars, and the art of ruling men. But it was Achilles he loved best of all, the hero who chose a short and blazing life over a long and quiet one, and something of that choice seems to have settled into the boy and never left him. He wanted, even then, to matter more than any man had mattered. He wanted, quite simply, the world. There is a story from those early years that everyone told afterwards, because it seemed to explain him. A horse dealer had brought a magnificent black stallion to Philip's court, a beast so wild that none of the grooms could mount it, and Philip was ready to send it away. But the boy watched, and saw what the grown men had missed, that the horse was frightened of nothing but its own shadow, thrown large and trembling on the ground before it. So Alexander turned the animal gently to face the sun, until the shadow fell behind and out of sight, and then, speaking low, he climbed onto its back and rode. His father, they say, wept with a strange mixture of pride and fear, and told him that Macedon would be too small for him, that he must go and find a kingdom worthy of himself. The horse was called Bucephalus, and it would carry him to the very edge of the known earth, and he would grieve for it there like a brother. So it was no restless whim that turned him east, but a thing he had been walking toward his whole life. In the spring, with his kingdom secured behind him and a young man's certainty ahead, he gathered the army his father had perfected and marched it down to the narrow water that divides Europe from Asia. He crossed the strait the Greeks called the Hellespont, and as his ship neared the far shore he is said to have hurled his spear into the sand of that continent and leapt after it, claiming Asia as a gift won by the spear, before a single battle had been fought. He turned aside first to the ruin of old Troy, to lay a wreath at the tomb he believed to be Achilles, to run the course the heroes ran, to touch the past he had dreamed of as a child. And only then did he turn to meet the vast, ancient, almost unimaginable empire that lay waiting for him, an empire that had swallowed kingdoms whole, that stretched from these near shores away east into deserts and mountains no Greek had ever named. The first blow fell at a river called the Granicus, where the local Persian governors had drawn up their horsemen along the steep far bank, thinking the crossing itself would break the young invader. It nearly did. Alexander went in at the head of his companion cavalry, straight through the water and up into the spears, and in the press of it a Persian blade split his helmet and came within a breath of ending everything before it had begun. A friend's sword saved his life at the last instant. But the line held, and then it broke, the Persian side, not the Greek, and the road into Asia lay open. The following winter he met a far greater danger at a place called Issus, where the Persian king himself, Darius, waited with an army so large it could not properly deploy on the cramped coastal plain. There, against every sensible expectation, the smaller force shattered the larger, and Darius fled the field in his chariot as the light failed, leaving behind his tent, his treasure, and his own mother, wife, and children to the mercy of the boy who had beaten him. Somewhere between these battles came the strangest moment of all, the one that seemed to seal his legend. In an old inland city called Gordium there stood an ancient wagon, its yoke bound to its pole by a knot so intricate, so hopelessly tangled, that no one for centuries had been able to find its ends. And there was a prophecy attached to it, whispered in every market, that whoever could loose the Gordian knot was destined to rule all of Asia. Alexander came to it, and studied it, and worked at it for a while as other men had, and could not find the way in. And then, because he was who he was, he drew his sword and cut clean through it in a single stroke, and told them the prophecy was fulfilled. Some called it genius, and some called it a boy's impatience dressed as fate, and perhaps it was both. But that night the ends of the knot lay severed on the ground, and the whole of Asia lay ahead of him, unconquered and waiting. He was 22 years old, he had beaten the great king twice, and he had not the smallest intention of stopping, and still, somewhere far to the east, beyond the deserts and the rivers, Darius was alive, and gathering everything his ruined empire had left to throw against him. And so the story moves eastward now, into the great flat heart of the world, where two armies gathered on a plain called Gaugamela in the autumn of 331 before the Common Era. Imagine, if you will, the size of it. Darius had learned the lesson of his defeats, and he had chosen his ground with care, a wide, open field near the modern town of Mosul, in what is now northern Iraq, land he had ordered smoothed and leveled so that his side chariots could run without obstacle, and his cavalry could wheel in their tens of thousands. He had drawn men from every corner of an empire that still stretched from the Aegean to the mountains of India, Bactrians and Sogdians, Indians with their elephants, Scythian horse archers from the endless grasslands, and the immortal spearmen of Persia itself. By the ancient accounts he commanded hundreds of thousands, and though we may doubt the exact numbers, we need not doubt that Alexander's army, perhaps 47,000 strong, looked out across that plain at a host that seemed to have no edges at all. The night before the battle, they say, Alexander's officers came to him and urged a night attack, for the enemy was too many to face in daylight. And Alexander answered that he would not steal a victory like a thief. Then he went to his tent and slept so deeply and so late that his generals had to wake him when the sun was already up and the men stood waiting in their ranks. Whether this was the calm of true confidence, or a boy's theatre performed for an audience that needed to believe in him, no one alive can say. But he slept, and Darius across the field kept his vast army standing under arms all night, afraid of the very attack that never came, so that when morning broke the Persians were already tired, and the Macedonians were rested. What happened on that plain was less a clash of walls than a thing of angles and patience. Alexander did not charge the center. He led his companion cavalry out toward the right, drawing the Persian left after him, stretching their line, tempting it, until a gap opened in the great host like a seam pulling apart in cloth. And into that gap he turned, all at once, a wedge of horsemen driving straight for the place where Darius stood beneath his royal standard. It is said the two kings came within sight of one another in the dust and the noise, the young conqueror and the tall, frightened king, and that Darius, seeing death riding toward him, did what he had done at Issus 2 years before. He turned his chariot, and he fled. And when the great king flees, the army that fights in his name discovers it has nothing left to fight for. The vast host came apart, and streamed away across the darkening plain, and the empire of Cyrus and Xerxes, the empire that had once sent its ships against Athens and its soldiers through the pass at Thermopylae, was broken in an afternoon. After Gaugamela the doors of the world simply opened. Babylon, that ancient city of hanging gardens and star-watching priests, threw its gates wide and welcomed him with garlands and silver altars, and Alexander walked its processional way beneath the blue-glazed lions of the Ishtar Gate as a liberator, sacrificing to their god Marduk as the Persian kings never had. Then Susa, with its treasuries. And then, in the depth of winter, Persepolis itself, the ceremonial capital, the beating heart of Persian pride, its great terrace crowded with columns and carved processions of tribute-bearers from every nation. There, amid feasting and wine, something dark came loose. The palace of Xerxes, the king who had burned the temples of the Athenian Acropolis a century and a half before, went up in flames. Some say it was cold policy, a signal to the Greek world that the long war of revenge was finished and paid in full. Others say it was drunkenness, a courtesan named Thais calling for fire at a banquet, torches thrown in laughter that no one could take back by morning. Perhaps, as with the knot, it was both. But the smoke rose over the plain of Persia, and by first light the seat of the Achaemenids was a field of blackened stone, and it stands roofless to this day. Darius did not live to see the end of his own ruin. he fled eastward with the remnant of his court, and there, on a dusty road, his own noblemen turned on him, a satrap named Bessus and his conspirators, who bound their king in chains of gold and, when Alexander's pursuit drew near, ran him through and left him to die by the roadside. When the Macedonians found him he was already gone, or nearly so, and Alexander, they say, covered the body with his own cloak and sent it back to be buried among the tombs of the kings. The man he had chased across 3,000 miles had died by other hands than his, and something in the chase went out of him then. He was no longer the avenger of Greece. He was becoming, more and more, the successor to the very kings he had destroyed, wearing their robes, taking their titles, asking his Macedonians to bow before him as Easterners bowed, which they hated, and would not forgive. Yet he did not stop. That is the thing about him that is hardest to hold in the mind, he did not stop. On he marched, and on, into lands the Greeks knew only as names in old travelers' tales. Through the mountains of Afghanistan, where he founded cities and named them all Alexandria, one after another across the roof of the world. Over the Hindu Kush, whose snows swallowed men whole. Into Bactria and Sogdiana, where he fought a long, grinding, cruel war against people who would not be conquered and would not stay conquered. He took a wife there, Roxana, a lord's daughter from a high mountain fortress, married for love or for peace or for both. And still eastward, over the Indus, into the green heat of the Punjab, where he fought his last great pitched battle against a king named Polis and his war elephants in the rain and the mud along the river Hydaspes, and won, and was so moved by his enemy's courage that he gave him back his kingdom to rule as a friend. And then, at last, at a river called the Hyphasis, the thing happened that no enemy had managed in 8 years. His own men stopped. They had marched, by then, some 11,000 miles from home. Their armor had rusted and been patched with hide, their Greek clothing had long since rotted away. They had heard that beyond the next river lay a greater one, and beyond that the kingdoms of the Ganges with armies vaster than any they had faced, and endless reigns, and no end at all to the east. And they were tired in a way that no speech could reach. Alexander pleaded, and raged, and shut himself in his tent for 3 days as Achilles had sulked in his, waiting for them to relent. They did not. And for the first time in his life he turned back, not beaten by any king, but by the weariness of the men who loved him. They built 12 great altars on the riverbank to mark the farthest edge of the known world, and then they began the long, terrible road home, through a desert that killed more of them than any battle ever had. He came at last to Babylon again, the city that had welcomed him as a liberator, and there he sat amid the unfinished business of the largest empire the world had yet seen, planning new voyages, new conquests, a road around Arabia. And there, in the early summer of 323 before the Common Era, after a night of drinking, a fever took him. It rose day by day, and his voice failed, and still his soldiers filed past his bed one by one, because they would not believe he could die, and he could only lift his hand to them as they passed. On the 10th day he died. He was 32 years old. And when they asked him, near the end, to whom he left his kingdom, the answer that has come down to us is only 2 words, quiet and terrible, to the strongest. He named no son, no heir, no plan. He simply closed his eyes, and left the whole of the world he had gathered lying open on the table between men who had followed him to the ends of the earth, and who now looked at one another across his body, each of them wondering the same thing, none of them daring yet to say it aloud. Alexander was dead, and the world he had left open on the table did not stay open for long. His generals, the men history would come to call the Diadochi, the successors, leaned in over that silence and began, slowly at first and then not slowly at all, to take. There was no plan. There was a half-brother who could not rule, a wife who was not yet delivered of a child, and a dozen soldiers who had walked from Macedon to the edge of India and back, and who now understood, each in his own way, that the empire belonged to whoever was willing to reach out and hold a piece of it. So they reached. And for 40 years, in a long and tangled quarrel that ran from the Nile to the Hindu Kush, they carved the largest empire the world had yet seen into the shape it would keep for centuries. Let the name settle over you gently, the way lamplight settles over a room. Ptolemy, the careful one, the friend who had known Alexander since boyhood, who did not grasp at the whole because he had already seen where grasping at the whole would lead. He took Egypt, the oldest and richest of the provinces, a land that fed itself on the flood of a single river, walled off by desert on every side, defensible and calm. He took the body of Alexander too, intercepted the grey golden funeral carriage as it made its slow way west and carried the dead king down to the city that bore his name, to lie in Alexandria under glass. And there Ptolemy founded a dynasty that would last 300 years, Greek kings on the throne of the pharaohs, worshipped as gods on the banks of the Nile, ruling a country whose language they mostly never bothered to learn. Far to the east there was Seleucus, who took the hardest inheritance of all, the vast Asian heart of the empire, the old Persian lands, a territory so wide it took months to cross. His kingdom ran from the shores of the Mediterranean across Mesopotamia and up onto the Iranian plateau, a patchwork of peoples and tongues and gods held together by nothing but roads and garrisons and the stubborn will of one man and his heirs. And in the middle, in Macedon itself, the homeland, the rocky highland kingdom from which all of it had begun, there settled at last the line of Antigonus, the Antigonids, who held Greece and the Aegean and the old capital at Pella, and who spent their strength keeping the restless Greek cities to the south from slipping out of their hands. 3 great kingdoms, then, where there had been one empire. Egypt of the Ptolemies, Asia of the Seleucids, Macedon of the Antigonids, and around and between them a scattering of smaller powers, Pergamon on its acropolis above the plain, the island republics, the leagues of mainland cities. They fought each other for generations, these successor kings, in wars that rarely settled anything and never quite ended. But that is not, in the end, the thing worth remembering about them. The thing worth remembering is what they built while they fought. For Alexander had done something in his short life that outlasted every border his generals drew. He had carried Greece out of Greece. He had planted Greek cities, dozens of them, Alexandrias and their imitations, like seeds across 3,000 miles of Asia and Africa, and now, in the long lamplit centuries after his death, those seeds grew. This was the world we call Hellenistic, not classical Greece, small and sharp and self-contained, but something larger and stranger and more mingled, a Greek civilization that had spilled out past its own edges and begun to soak into everything it touched. Picture the cities. Picture Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile, laid out on a grid by the sea, with its lighthouse rising 400 feet above the harbor, a tower of white stone with a fire burning at its top that sailors could see from far out on the dark water. Picture its great library, where the Ptolemies tried, with something close to obsession, to gather every book that had ever been written, where scribes copied and scholars argued and a man named Eratosthenes measured the size of the whole round earth with a stick and a shadow and got the answer very nearly right. Picture Anch on its river in Syria, and Seleucia on the Tigris, and far away in the east, on the edge of the steppe, a city called Arichanum where a Greek gymnasium and a Greek theatre stood beneath the mountains of Afghanistan, and where someone had carved the old wisdom of Delphi, know yourself, nothing in excess, onto a pillar 10,000 miles from home. And in these cities the world began to blend in ways the men of old Athens could never have imagined. A Greek merchant might marry a Persian wife. A temple might honor a god who was Greek and Egyptian at once, Serapis, invented deliberately to be worshipped by both. In the far kingdom of Bactria, Greek kings would one day stamp their portraits on coins alongside the wheel of the Buddha, and Greek sculptors would teach the East to carve the human face, so that for centuries afterward the Buddha himself would be shown draped in the folds of a Greek robe, with the calm features the Greeks had given him. Ideas moved along the roads with the caravans. Astronomy from Babylon flowed west, philosophy from Athens flowed east, and everywhere the same soft, practical tongue smoothed the way between them. For that was perhaps the quietest and most lasting gift of all, the language. Not the sharp local dialect of any one city, but a simplified, shared Greek, worn smooth by 1,000 miles of use, the Koine, the common tongue. A trader in Egypt and a scribe in Syria and a soldier on the Persian plateau could all understand one another in it. It was the language of business and letters and government across the whole Eastern world, and it held that place for centuries, long enough that when, 300 years later, a handful of men in Judea wanted to write down a new faith and send it out to every nation, they would write it not in Hebrew, not in Latin, but in Koine Greek, because that was still the language everyone could read. The words of the New Testament come down to us in the common Greek of Alexander's successors. His generals are dust, their kingdoms are gone, but the tongue their soldiers carried outlived them all by 2,000 years. So this was the world the Diadochi made, almost without meaning to, a world where a boy in Egypt and a monk in Bactria and a philosopher in Athens all lived, in some sense, inside the same wide Greek room, lit by the same lamps, speaking words the others could understand. Greece had become too large for Greece. It had stopped being a place and started becoming an idea, a manner of thinking and building and speaking that belonged to no single city and to all of them at once. And yet, for all its brightness, there was a shadow moving at the western edge of this lamplit world, still small, still far away, easy to overlook. While the successor kings quarreled among themselves over the ruins of Alexander's dream, a different kind of power was rising on a peninsula across the sea, a hard, patient, unhurried city on 7 hills, that did not build libraries or argue over gods, but built roads and legions, and remembered every insult, and never, ever let go of anything it had once taken hold of. The Greeks did not think of it much yet. But it was watching. And it was coming. The night has gone quiet in the successor kingdoms, and the greatest lamp of that quiet age burned not in Athens or in Sparta, but in a young city on the edge of the Egyptian delta, where the Nile at last let go of the land and slid into the sea. Alexander had marked its outline himself, they said, walking the ground and sketching the streets with barley meal because he had no chalk, and when the birds came down and ate the grain his seers called it an omen, that the city would feed the whole world. He did not live to see a single wall of it rise. He was carried back there in the end, sealed in honey or in gold depending on who tells the story, and laid in a tomb at the heart of the town that bore his name, while his general Ptolemy took Egypt for his own and founded a line of kings who would rule it for 300 years. And it was those kings, Greek-speaking pharaohs in a land older than memory, who decided that Alexandria would be the mind of the age. They built a house of the Muses, a museum, in the first and truest sense of that word, and beside it, or within it, they built a library. Not a room of scrolls but an appetite in the shape of a building, a hunger to gather every book that had ever been written in any tongue and bring it under one roof. The Ptolemies sent agents into every port with silver to buy manuscripts, and when buying failed they borrowed, and when borrowing failed they simply kept what they had borrowed. It is said that every ship that docked in the harbor was searched, not for contraband but for books, and any scroll found aboard was carried off to the library, copied by the scribes, and the copy, not the original, returned to its owner. They called these the writings from the ships. By the height of it there were hundreds of thousands of scrolls stacked in their pigeonholes, tagged with little tongues of papyrus, and men who spent their whole lives among them cataloguing, comparing, arguing over which line of Homer was true and which had crept in later. It was, for a few golden generations, the closest thing the ancient world ever built to a single gathered memory of itself. And into that gathered quiet came the geometers. There was a man named Euclid who taught there, of whom we know almost nothing as a person, not where he was born, not where he died, only that he wrote a book. But what a book! He took the scattered knowledge of shapes and numbers, the theorems men had half proved and passed down like folk wisdom, and he laid them out in a single unbroken chain of reasoning, each truth resting on the one before it, back and back to a handful of definitions so simple a child could not deny them. A point is that which has no part. A line is length without breadth. From these small seeds he grew the whole forest, and he called the work the elements, and men would learn geometry from it for more than 2,000 years, longer than any book but scripture. There is a story, probably invented, that King Ptolemy asked him whether there was not some shorter road to geometry than working through all these propositions, and Euclid answered that there is no royal road. The mind must walk the whole way on its own feet. It is a good story to fall asleep on, the idea that some things cannot be hurried, that understanding is a path and not a gift. Down the coast and across the years worked another of the library's keepers, a man named Eratosthenes, who was called Beta by his rivals because they said he was second best at everything and first at nothing. Perhaps. But this second best man did a first-rate thing. He had read that in the town of Seen, far to the south, on the longest day of the year the sun stood directly overhead at noon, so that it lit the very bottom of a deep well and cast no shadow at all. In Alexandria, on that same day and hour, a vertical rod did cast a shadow, a short and slanting one. And Eratosthenes understood that if the earth were flat, the sun's rays falling on both towns would strike at the same angle, but they did not. The difference in the shadows was the curve of the world itself, bending away between the two cities. He measured the angle. He knew the distance between the towns. And with nothing more than a stick, a shadow, and a mind willing to trust its own arithmetic, he reckoned the circumference of the whole round earth, and came within a few hundred miles of the truth. Imagine it, a man in a library, measuring a planet by the length of a shadow, and getting it very nearly right. Far away on the island of Sicily, in the Greek city of Syracuse, worked the strangest and most brilliant of them all, a man named Archimedes, who slid weights and levers and spirals through his mind the way other men slide beads on a string. He found how to measure the volume of a crown by the water it pushed aside, and ran, the tale goes, naked and dripping through the streets shouting that he had found it. He wrote of levers that if only he had a place to stand, he could move the world with one. When the Romans came at last to besiege his city, this old geometer bent his mind to war, and his machines, his claws that lifted ships from the sea, his beams that dropped stones on the decks, held the legions off for 2 long years. And when the walls finally fell, and a soldier came upon an old man crouched over shapes he had drawn in the sand, Archimedes is said to have looked up and asked only that the man not disturb his circles. The soldier ran him through. It is a small and terrible parable of the whole age, the patient mind and the impatient sword, the diagram and the blade, and which of the two the world would let survive. And there was one thinker, quietest of all, who saw furthest and was believed least. His name was Aristarchus of the island of Samos, and while every other astronomer set the earth unmoving at the center of all things, Aristarchus dared to place the sun there instead, and to send the earth swinging round it like the other wandering stars, and to spin the earth itself upon a turning axis to make the night and the day. He guessed the sun was far larger than the earth, and reasoned that a thing so large would not circle a thing so small. He was right by 17 centuries, right long before anyone was ready to be right, and so he was set gently aside, a curiosity, a man who had followed his numbers past the edge of what the world could yet believe. His book on it is lost. Only a sentence here and there survives, quoted by others, the way you might remember a single line of a dream. The lamp of Alexandria burned brightest just here, at the moment it lit a truth no one would pick up again for 1,000 years. So the golden dusk of Greek thought settled over that harbor city, warm and slow, the scrolls whispering in their honeycomb of shelves, the geometers walking their unhurried roads, the sun that Aristarchus had crowned sinking each evening into the same sea that had carried Alexander's body home. It felt, to those who lived inside it, like a beginning that would never end. But lamps, however bright, burn oil, and oil runs low, and the men who kept this one lit were Greeks in a Greek-ruled peace that was, mile by patient mile, closing in around them. For while the scholars measured shadows and moved imagined worlds, the hard city on its 7 hills had crossed the sea in earnest now, and its roads were reaching east, and one by one the kingdoms Alexander's generals had carved from his empire were falling, not to a wiser mind, but to a longer sword. Rome did not come as Alexander had come, in a single golden rush that lit the whole horizon at once. Rome came slowly, the way winter comes to a warm country, a coolness in the evening air, a shortening of the light, a thing you feel before you can name it. For a long while the Greek kingdoms barely turned their heads. They were busy with their old quarrels, Macedon against the leagues against each other, the Seleucids counting their far provinces, the Ptolemies dreaming in their marble city by the Nile. And out in the west, across the water, a stubborn republic of farmers and soldiers was learning, war by war, that it did not lose. It lost battles. It never lost wars. That was the difference no one in the East quite understood until it was already too late to matter. The reckoning for Macedon came on a summer afternoon in the year we count as 168 before our era, on a plain near a little town called Pydna, under the shadow of Mount Olympus, where the gods were said to sleep. King Perseus had drawn up the phalanx his ancestors had made famous, the long spears leveled, the bronze shields locked, that bristling wall of iron that had once carried Alexander to the edge of the world. And for an hour it worked, as it had always worked, the Romans giving ground before that terrible hedge of points. But the phalanx was a creature of flat, unbroken earth, and the ground near Pydna was not flat. As the Macedonians pressed forward over the rising, rutted field, small gaps opened in their perfect line, here a hollow, there a hillock, and into those gaps the Roman soldiers stepped, short swords drawn, in under the reach of the spears, where a man with a long pike is only a man holding a heavy stick. It was over in perhaps an hour. The kingdom that Philip had forged and Alexander had made immortal simply ceased to be a kingdom. Perseus was taken to Italy to walk in chains through a Roman triumph, and the line of Macedonian kings, which reached back beyond memory into legend, ended not with a battle so much as with a stumble on uneven ground. And still the Greeks did not entirely believe it. Even conquered, they argued and maneuvered and hoped, as people do who have been the center of the world so long they cannot imagine the center moving. The old cities of the south, the proud League of Achaia, thought perhaps that Rome could still be defied, that the game of playing one power against another had a few moves left in it. They were wrong, and the proof of how wrong was made in the year 146, in a way meant never to be forgotten. Corinth, wealthy Corinth, city of two seas, of bronze and perfume and pleasure, one of the loveliest of all the Greek cities, was made an example. The Roman general Mummius took it, and on the orders of the Senate the city was destroyed, the men killed, the women and children sold into slavery, the treasures of centuries loaded onto ships bound for Italy, and the buildings themselves thrown down and burned. It was said, though perhaps it is only a story people needed to tell, that the fire ran so hot through all that bronze and gold that the metals melted and mingled and ran together in the gutters, and cooled into a new alloy that collectors prized ever after, the beauty of a dead city, poured out and hardened into something you could hold. In that same year, far to the west, Rome erased Carthage as well. Two of the ancient world's great cities, gone in a single season. The Mediterranean had a master now, and it did not intend to explain itself twice. One kingdom remained, the last and the strangest, the one that held out longest simply because it lay furthest and richest and most guarded by its own long river, Egypt, ruled still by the Greek house of Ptolemy from the marble halls of Alexandria, where the great library still whispered on its shelves and the lighthouse still burned above the harbor. And the end there, when it came, was not a battle line but a woman and two men and the last civil war of the Roman world spilling out across the Eastern Sea. Cleopatra, the seventh of her name, the only one of all her Greek line who ever bothered to learn the Egyptian tongue, bound her fortunes first to one Roman master and then to another, and when the second of them lost, when the fleets clashed at Actium and the wind and the day went the wrong way, there was nowhere left in all the world for a Greek monarch to stand. In the year 30 before our era, in the palace by the sea, she chose her own hour to leave, and with her the long procession of Greek kings that had begun with Alexander's companions 300 years before came quietly to its close. Egypt became a province. The map, from Spain to Syria, was one color now, and the color was Rome. And here is the thing that no conqueror ever quite expects, the gentlest irony in all the long history of the world. Rome had beaten the Greeks in every field where swords decide things. And Rome, in beating them, was quietly and utterly conquered in return. For the hard men of the Seven Hills looked upon the thing they had defeated, the temples, the poems, the philosophy, the geometry, the theatre, the gods with their human faces and their human griefs, and they did not destroy it. They fell in love with it. They shipped Greek statues home by the boatload and set them in their gardens. They hired Greek tutors for their sons and Greek doctors for their bodies and Greek architects for their cities. They took the Greek gods and gave them Latin names and worshipped them all the same. Their poets rewrote Homer, their thinkers footnoted Plato, their emperors, when they wished to seem wise, spoke Greek. A Roman poet said it best, and knew it was true even as he wrote it, that captive Greece had taken her fierce captor captive. The sword had won the land. The dream had won the sword. And so everything Greece had made did not die at Pydna or in the ashes of Corinth or in the palace at Alexandria. It simply changed carriers, the way a flame is passed from a guttering lamp to a fresh one, and went on burning, west into Europe and forward into every century that followed, all the way, quietly, patiently, into the room where you are lying now. The cities sleep. That is how it ends, and it is a soft ending, softer than the sword ever was. The stones of Knossos settle deeper into their Cretan hill. The marble of Athens weathers to honey and to grey, column by column, under 10,000 slow sunsets. The sand drifts a little further over what was Alexandria. And none of it is truly gone, it is only resting, held safe in the words we still read and the shapes we still build and the questions we are still, all of us, trying to answer. The lamps are going out now, one by one, across all those centuries, Knossos, Athens, Alexandria, and that is all right. Nothing is lost that was ever loved this well. If this quiet journey through the Greek world has softened the edges of your night, stay with me. There are more sleeping cities waiting, more lost worlds to wander through together in the dark. Subscribe and let the next story find you here when you're ready. For now, close your eyes. The marble is cool, the sea is calm, and the past will keep its long, patient watch while you rest.